Good morning. Good morning and welcome to our third and final day of the 2023 Black Church Studies Consultation. All right, now here I am. We'll begin our day with prayer, followed by the schedule of events. Please bow your heads with me. Most gracious God, we come to you today. We thank you for the opportunity for us to gather as your people. Be with us throughout our time today. Help us to garner all of the wisdom, all of the knowledge, and everything that we need. Then, oh God, please guide us as we take what we have learned and we take it back to our individual communities as we help to change the lives of people, but not just people in our inner circle or around us, but in the world and beyond. This we pray in the mighty name of Jesus. Amen. All right, we start with our schedule. From 8:45 to 9:45, we have our third plenary session with Reverend Dr. Trina Armstrong. The title is The Pastor as a Mental Health and Mental Illness Counselor. From 9:45 to 10, we'll have the opportunity to ask Dr. Trina questions and get her answers and see just what we want to know more about. From 10 to 10:10, we will have our morning break, followed by 10:15 to 11:15, plenary session 4 with Reverend Dr. Nicholas Grier, Surviving and Sustaining Mental Health Obstacles. From 11:15 to 11:30, we will also have the opportunity to ask Dr. Grier some questions and get some truly good answers. From 11:30 to 12, Dr. Gerald Taylor will be our guide as we view an architectural vision for the Nehemiah churches in the 21st century in concert with the University of Kentucky School of Architecture. We think that you will find what the slides that you get to view quite exciting. And then from 12 noon to 12:30, we'll have closing remarks and closing prayer with Dr. Taylor. Amen. We pray that you will find today as productive, if not more productive, than you did yesterday. Dr. Kauser, we turn it over to you.
Good morning, friends. My task this morning is to introduce Dr. Trina Armstrong, and I do that with affection and gladness. Dr. Trina Armstrong, affectionately known as Dr. Trina, joined the faculty of Louisville Seminary in August 2022 as Director and Associate Professor of Marriage and Family Therapy. She previously served as Director of Pastoral and Clinical Mental Health Counseling and Assistant Professor of Pastoral Theology at Grier Evangelical Theological Seminary, and as founder and inaugural Director of Interreligious Chaplaincy and Assistant Professor of Pastoral Care and Counseling at United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities. Dr. Trina earned her PhD and MA in Practical Theology, Spiritually Integrated Psychology at the Claremont School of Theology, an MA in Psychology, Marriage and Family Therapy from California Southern University, and an MDiv from Fuller Theological Seminary. Her research intersects with practical and womanist theology, post-trauma psychology, and relational cultural theory. She also researches issues of loss, grief, death, and dying crisis care, and the impact of historical trauma on the well-being of African American families and interpersonal relationships. Dr. Trina is a licensed marriage and family therapist in multiple states. She is the founder of the Center for Wellness Encounters, a mental health wellness organization for individuals, families, and couples. She has extensive therapy and pastoral care and counseling experience in many settings as a hospice chaplain, community-based systemic family therapist, and as a marriage and family therapist in several group practices. Dr. Trina is an ordained itinerant elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Her publications include Caring for Single Black Mothers, Unveiling Trauma and Loss, 2022, Pastoral Care in Pandemics, Attending to Grief and Loss, with and Stock Publications, 2022, The Gift of Empathy and Compassion in Trauma-Informed Care, Wanting, and Removing the Rot at the Core, Black Theology and Psychotherapy, an Integrative Approach Towards Liberation from Psychological Slavery, in the AME Church Review, 2010. Dr. Trina is a member of the American Association of Marriage and Family Therapy, the Association of Black Psychologists, the American Psychological Association, the Society for Pastoral Theology, and the American Academy of Religion. Dr. Trina, we welcome you again to the floor for plenary number 3. Welcome, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Angela. Welcome. Good morning, everyone. Glad to be here for this second day. I'm sure yesterday was filled with a lot of great presentations and knowledge, and just immersing us into conversations about mental health, the Black church, and really how we can all be better seers of what is around us. Oftentimes we don't see it, right? Even though it is very present, many things are invisible, some things are visible, but it is about the eyes. What do we see? What do we not see? Okay, so this morning, my presentation is focused on the pastor as mental health counselor. So really focusing on so pastor is broad. You can assume that just means folks who are leading churches, but many people function in other pastoral capacities. I have been an associate minister for most of my ministry in the church context, so a wide variety of responsibilities, but also have been pastoring in other contexts like hospice ministry. In the mental health context is where I mostly have lived out my ministry. So it's a very wide context of what this word pastor means. I am going to, spend some time thinking about how pastors and churches, because that's where many Black people find refuge. They are also looking for answers increasingly about their mental health. But my sense is, I'm in my 5th decade, and I've done a wide variety of research on all these topics that I'm interested in. And so what we're finding is not new. I think the evolution of our societies, particularly around technology and the ways that people are living and describing their lives, are a little bit different. Perhaps we didn't have all of those things, and we didn't, right? So a lot of things were relegated to our homes, the secrecy of the ways in which families, pledged not to share the things that were going on in their homes because of the fears of what that may mean. We know from my presentation yesterday, there was a lot of racial implications of care and psychology and how Black people were thought of and cared for, and how we have learned to protect ourselves, right? How we have learned to pretty much live in survival mode for the most part, as we also endeavor to be part of this Western society that's really based on a lot of individualism, okay? So as opposed to our origins, which is more communal, right? more we're in this together in the spirit of Ubuntu. I am because we are. So part of what I'm going to be talking about is reclaiming that, right? Reclaiming what that means for our ministries as pastoral leaders in those various capacities of our ministries. Many of us have been trained, and theology is not immune to some of the ways in which we have been trained. Those of us who've been in theological education in some of those spaces have been trained to think more individualistically, right? And to reduce the things that we're seeing in our communities to simple pat answers, okay? And quite frankly, there is a lot of pushback and resistance to those things because those simply aren't meeting the needs of the people who are experiencing this range of suffering that we are seeing throughout our communities. And that has been since the beginning of time. It's in the Bible, okay? And so my slides are, minimal this time around. I want to try to save a portion of time for us to have some conversation and discussion and questions, and just, to hear how everybody is experiencing suffering, the responses to suffering in their various contexts. So it'll be a little bit more interactional than it was yesterday. So feel free to prepare any questions that you have that get evoked as I share my slides with you, and I look forward to having some conversation. Let me share my slides. Hold on just a second. So I wanted to just, in addition to opening, of just helping us to think about what it means to be a practitioner focusing on mental health. And then we've tended to talk about my presentation yesterday, we tended to kind of separate our physical, right, our physiological, our bodies, our organs, all of that stuff that essentially helps us to breathe and live and walk and experience the world, versus our psychological selves, our emotions, our feelings, our thoughts, our personalities, and the things that make us uniquely us. And the spiritual side of us, the part of us that is meaning making, right? Connection to God, connection to spirit, connection to Jesus, trying to cultivate those relationships, but also with a sense of meaning making and purpose. Like, what does all of this mean? What is my purpose in life? Oftentimes we spend quite a bit of time cultivating our relationship with Jesus Christ, right? With God, right? And what that means for our life. But in reality, it is really linked to meaning and purpose, right? God are you calling me to do? God, who you're calling me to be? And scripture has a lot to say about that, not in a way that's very clear, right? Which leaves it open to misinterpretation in ways that can be quite oppressive sometimes, right? So part of this presentation is going to help us to think about more compassionate ways of thinking about our humanity and responding to some of the challenges that we experience in our lives, normalizing those things instead of categorizing them off to the side as mental health problems to be fixed, okay? We have not always done a good job, right? So I'm gonna put the context in the church. We haven't, right? Either discussing it or supporting those with mental health challenges, okay? But if we look at scripture, I was at a Bible some while ago, and Bible study, and my pastor said, this is about humanity. This is about God's relationship with humanity. So if we look at Genesis versus Revelation, it's about God's relationship with humanity, right? The beginning of, God forming the world in 7 days and declaring that it is good. God resting and God in communication with the Trinity, right? This theological belief, God the Spirit and Jesus Christ. We don't know, the Trinity isn't named, but we know that there is an us, right? And that they're contemplating, right, creating humans made in their own image, right? We don't always know. There have been various interpretations of that. Many have concluded that is the essence of relationality and uniqueness, right? So that these three aspects of the Trinity are in relationship. They have different functions and therefore represents the uniqueness of humanity in relationship with each other, okay? And that's pretty much where I fall down theologically. And so there's this image of God, made in the image of God, that it's not, sort of this physical that I'm supposed to look like God, or even this way of being like God or Jesus Christ, but that the essence is relationality, right? We see this in the greatest commandment. The man comes to Jesus and says, what is the greatest commandment? And we know that there were 10. And oftentimes we still want to bring those into our present reality. But in Jesus' coming, Jesus says, the greatest commandment is to love the Lord with all your heart, Lord God, and love your neighbor as yourself, right? This centralizing it in love, right? Which says a whole lot about what this really means and how all of that has really been reflected in scripture. But we have a tendency to reduce it to rules. And even when we think about mental health challenges, so much of that stuff is in the Bible, right? Suffering, ways of being in relationship. The Psalms has so much to say to us about what it means to be human. David and some of the other originators of the Psalter and song and worship and praise almost always reflect some way of being in the world that's not always neat and pretty. Okay, but they do end with a declaration of God's power, God's love, and God's sovereignty, right? So that God is in the midst of their suffering, but they're not ashamed to talk about their suffering. There's voice, there's power in it, there's healing in it, right? We see this throughout the Old Testament. I'm sorry, the New Testament. We see it in the Old Testament, the Egyptians and Moses and leading them out of the wilderness and all of the ways in which they were complaining about the suffering and not having enough food and their fears and their joys and their losses and the ways in which God is trying to create a life, a reality in a way that is organized, that gives people an opportunity to flourish. And so really look at the Bible in different ways, right? So there's a lot of suffering and pain that we experience, right? And a lot of that is avoided in scripture. We don't talk a lot about that, right? There's a lot of abuse in scripture. And God is not always seen in the biggest light. Why would God destroy all of the things that he created and start over, right? We don't ask all of those hard questions about what it means to see all of those people die, right? That God gets to make that decision. But we see that throughout scripture, right? We see the hurts and the harms and the ways in which human beings can be, quite hurtful to one another. We saw that right after Genesis when one brother killed another brother. So, we try to interpret that in ways that, keep our little kid gloves on, but that's not what we're seeing in scripture, right? So we have to ask ourselves, why are we interpreting it in the most positive light that we can? What we see is, it's accepted fact that, suffering is part of the human experience. It just really is, right? Across our human, trajectory from birth to death, there's a lot of stuff that is happening, not only developmentally, right? I'm not the person I was when I was born, 50 something years ago. I'm not that, right? I probably have more years behind me than in front of me, but I got a whole lot of stuff to say. They always say when you look at a tombstone, from the date of birth to the end, there's a lot between the dash, right? And it's not all pretty, all right? That's the Bible never promises us that life is going to be good, right? So we don't always situate ourselves in the reality of death and loss, right? The ways in which we experience that. Some of what I'll share will be some of my own personal experiences around that, just briefly. In terms of the ways that I've experienced pastoral ministry is not very helpful. And so just sort of a way to encourage some conversation about that as well. The reality of it is also Christians are not exempt from mental health issues, right? It's how we understand it. So I talked about yesterday, a lot of colonization, or what that simply means is that those who are in power have the power to dictate who's human and what is suffering, and how we are going to exert power and control over certain segments of society, right? And orient them into our rules and our way of being for what? So we can control them, okay? So if you think of mental health, in terms of how I describe it, just a snippet of it, you can get a glimpse of how that has impacted Black people, right? Since the beginning of slavery, right? The way that they described our mental health issues, the way that they frankly did not care for us, the way that we're still dismissed in many healthcare organizations because they have the power to do so. So, recognizing that knowledge is so important. I think probably what's most frustrating to the people who come to my room in where I have been in parts of community, because, mental health work is not necessarily relegated to the room, although we think it is, right? Send that person to a therapist, right? What I'm going to do at the end of this session is I'm going to share, so you all get a copy of just the number of different ways that organizations are now doing communal work and really doing some intentional work about healing, right? I know the big question is always, how do we heal? But here's the challenge, right? That I try to help religious leaders and also therapists who are training to be spiritually integrated therapists in the many programs that I've been a part of, whether they were pastors or training to be therapists. But that to be, to think about the ways in which a lot of how we understand ourselves, understand scripture on spirituality and suffering, right, can also be very damaging, right? And so the guilt that some Christian communities have been made to feel when it's falsely assumed that mental health issues are a result of sin, and the erroneous belief that failure to be cured means that one is somehow lacking in faith, or the answer to one's issues is prayer. And what that means is many have suffered an extra burden unnecessarily by that deterministic one way of answering what people are experiencing in their lives. And that's unfortunate. And so, we'll have some conversation. When I look at the title, the pastor as mental health counselor. Okay, so as a professor, my students are so eager, right? They feel called to this vocation of helping, right? Whether they're, again, a range of vocations, pastors, chaplains, counselors, right? So I've had the wonderful privilege of nurturing persons into the beginning stages of those professions, okay? And they come in with a sense of discernment about who they are, what they want to do, perhaps not fully formed, depending on the context that people come in, the range of different church contexts, ethnicities, culture, even in the realm of Blackness, right? We could say we're all Black, but we're actually coming from different experience, right? Social, cultural differences, men, women. I've had the privilege of being in communities where there was a range of different sexualities that required an expansion of my own theology, expansion of what it means to be human when you have the range of folks who are sitting in those spaces. Inevitably, what I try to do is slow them down, right? They want to get to well, how do we do it, right? So many of you asked some of those same questions yesterday, right? I talked about the history. And, just sitting in that history, right? What does that mean to us when we have not received the care, right? We didn't decide to come to this country or be enslaved, yet we are having to be responsible for our own healing. And so, we want to know what that looks like. We want, hey, tell me how I can heal our people. Yeah, that's good information. But tell me how I can heal. It's a big question. I'll talk a little bit about that because that's what the pastor is mental health counselor. So an aspect of that is helping people heal. But from what, right? So I slow folks down and I say, hey, let's do this formation stuff, right? We don't always talk about formation in our church context, right? I'm ordained in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and while I believe that there's a formational process, it wasn't described in that way, okay? Mostly this language of formation comes out of the Catholic Church in the way that priests are trained in their particular educational institutions, priestly formation. So very specific. There's been some recent conversation in theological education as we're looking at the terrain of theological education to rethink what that means in, the contexts that are not Christian, right? So what does that mean to the range of denominations that exist in our theological education spaces, okay? The first question is always, who am I? Who am I as the pastor? What does that mean to me, right? And if I ask 10 Black pastors that question, they all gonna say different things, right? Some people believe that, they are the preacher, right? I think a lot of our Black churches, because that's the context that I've been in most of my life, is the centralization of preaching, the good news, right? This way in which that reflects perhaps that aspect of Jesus' ministry, right? The Sermon on the Mount, the way that Jesus was speaking to the multitudes and all of those ways in which proclamation and prophetic witnessing and was a central aspect of Jesus' ministry, and is the way that people are in our churches are coming to hear the good news, although it's not the only aspect of their spiritual formation, right? We looked at Jesus's ministry across his 3 years. It is a lot, right? We could say multifaceted ways in which Jesus represented what it means to be pastoral. Okay, and it's also, I think, reflected in the ways now that we're seeing different kinds of vocations. Like everybody's not going into the church to be a pastor, right? And for a while, right, if you didn't see yourself in that context, you went there anyway. I mean, those of us who are women, you know, that's been a story history of when we had access to those spaces. Doesn't mean we weren't ministering without the formal ordination. It just meant that we had to find other creative ways. We see that with Trina Lee, who recently celebrated her birthday, how Richard Allen didn't want to ordain her. There was no place for ministry and for women, yet she did it anyway. She preached until the day that she died. So what an amazing witness for those of us who have struggled to find places to live into our calling in churches. That's changing, of course. You know, there's still some denominations that do not allow women to be ordained. The Church of God in Christ is one of them, but you know, there's ministry happening anyway. It's just that sort of formal, recognition of ministry. So this idea of who am I, right? You see this with people who are going into chaplaincy. I have a whole full department of people who want to be therapists, right? Marriage and family therapists who see people in the context of their lives and all of the different ways in which people are feeling called, but in different spaces that are now available to us now. Okay, so who are you as a pastor in your various contexts? We know that word is mostly Christian, right? That's seeing God as the shepherd, the pastor, and the pastor, directing the sheep, caring for the sheep. So we know that in many ways it's also sort of a masculine name, but broaden it to understand our role in ministry. But who are you, right? What does that mean for you? I jotted down a bunch of thoughts of what I thought as I'm sort of developing my own understanding formation, not only for the context that I am in terms of how I'm nurturing professionals into this role of therapy, but also in some ways how I've experienced it over my life, right? Now that I've been introduced to the word, right? I came in seminary education pretty ignorant, not knowing what this was about, just really that I was called, and fortunately have been in some wonderful spaces that helped to nurture me in those living into this call of, caring professional. So I've come to understand it as whole person formation, right? Before we get to the how-to, I'm going to get to that. This whole, it's not just education, or it's not just accepting the call, it is lifelong, right? In the context of our development as persons, this idea of becoming, right? So you can really say it's not about what I do, although we reduce it to that, but it's more so, who am I, right? My identity, right? As a helper, as a religious professional, as a pastor in whatever capacity we serve, right? So this formation is lifelong, it's ongoing, because we're going to, as I said, in the life cycle, we're going to experience a lot of stuff, right? We're going to experience the death of persons, friends, families, dating, marrying, children, all of those things, loss, jobs, all of those things, right? We're going to experience all of that. So the ability to adapt and change and to reflect on those life experiences, right, is an important part of our formation, right? Because if we don't do that, we kind of get lost in the shifts and changes, the crisis of life, and just kind of focus on that and not step back and open ourselves up to the adjusting, the ways in which some of these life's experiences could invite us to make changes in our life, right? So that we simply cannot be the same persons that we were, right, when we first started our ministries, right? Trina Lee said that after I'm going to do this ministry until I die. My sense is she was somebody completely different than the person she was when she first started her ministry, right? But that's only because of the ability to recognize, when do I need to make change? Sort of that humility that's required, but only when we pay attention to ourselves, okay? This constant reflection about who is God and how is God working in my life? How is God working in the world, right? In terms of what am I seeing? Because if we go in there with answers, right, we call it deterministic, like this is what it is, right? Without having the ability to be curious, to be open to different ways of seeing God working in my life, God working in the lives of those that I'm caring for, right? I'm going to get stuck, right? And that's going to end up being burnout because a lot of that stuff just isn't going to make sense. People aren't going to make sense. And frankly, I don't have a whole lot of control over that. But I'm always mindful of the way that God shows up in my life, right? The way that God shows up in the communities that I'm a part of, the way that God shows up. I'm a keen observer of culture, people, right? And I believe that that's who we should be as well, right? But sometimes we just micro focus on the word of God, right? But the word of God is all of this, right? It's not just what's in that book, right? Skills, education, and training, right? There's a lot of stuff. I was a computer programmer for the first half of my life. So I've had to do a lot of education and training, part of the denominational requirements, part of the therapy requirements. We have to do continuing education units. I've done a lot of study on my own. I'm a curious learner. I don't want to get so caught up in this is what I know that I'm not a help to the diversity of experiences and people that I'm seeing. So being a reader of ways in which people are describing their experiences to help us be better at our jobs, right? I believe that God is in all of that. Some people would say, well, it's not in the Bible, then why should I read that? That's our understanding, right? Our theology of who God is. Where is God working in the world, right? Is God working through us, right? This way in which, Jesus, the incarnation, what does that mean, right? If it's not this vertical theology of God is up there and not working in us, but it's God working through us, using our unique gifts, skills, and talents to share our experience with each other. And sometimes that is knowledge and experiences in books. So we have access to that, right? And so the ways in which that is also a part of our formation. Talked about the ongoing reflection on life experiences and my embeddedness in communities, right? And in the relationships that also shape and change us, right? I have been so grateful for being in some wonderful communities. Some have not, been very nurturing, but many of the communities have been, and just the relationships that I've had across the terrain of all, whether it's in education, whether it's the various jobs that I've had, because we see each other in the context of our relationships, right? So many people in this present day are lonely. They don't have access to life-giving relationships where they're seen, heard, and valued, right? A lot of that stuff, people are sort of resorting to social media and some of those ways in which, they're trying to be seen and relate and connect. And so, that's an evolution of something. It'll be interesting to see how that turns out because many people are spending time believing that that's authentic community. So what does it mean to be in authentic community, right? So it's not just about us, where we can learn from each other. Of course, many of us who are in these professions are bound to ethical expectations. We know that that's a lot of stuff that's happening in our churches where ethics is not a priority. People are making different decisions without an understanding of how that affects the people in those congregations, right? Whether it's harm, sexual abuse, fiduciary abuse. My denomination had a whole big old something around fiduciary abuse that's still unfolding, and so busy trying to fix the problem, not understanding the impact on the people who contributed money and finances and some of those things. So the ethical expectations order us, right? Not sort of in a rigid sense, but just laws that necessarily has to organize how we treat one another, right? How we are good stewards of the resources that we have in a way, as many caring professions say, do no harm, right? So what it means to understand our moral selves as people who, live in a world that has the kind of boundaries that do not cause harm, okay? Spiritual practices, right? One of my mentors, Barbara Holmes, wrote a book, Joy Unspeakable, and it's about the contemplative practices in Black church, and where she took a historical survey of, what we brought into America in terms of our African religion. We don't always include that aspects of ourselves in the who are we. I've taken pilgrimages to Ghana and Brazil, the places where Africans were mostly either caught or they were sent to, right? Brazil is where Africans were mostly sent, high numbers. The numbers of slaves here were by breeding, right? In Brazil, right? Salvador Bahia, right? You can see right? The combinations of different African tribes that coexisted, created rituals and ways of thriving in spite of some of the oppression that's still going on. So wonderful way to go back and to have a sense of, right, who were we before we came, right? What sort of religious ways in which we were trying to make sure sense of our existence. So what she did was she talked about some of those contemplative practices that's not just about prayer or worship, but that has other liturgical implications and things that we can do to actually enhance our spiritual lives. So for me, this is an aspect of formation that I don't think we have the fullest sense of in a way that it help us to think about, well, then how do I live into my ministry if I'm grounding myself in this sense of becoming, formation, right? An aspect of that is also my well-being, right? The understanding of the experiences that I've had, that if I don't, right, if I'm not honest about those experiences, if I'm not caring for myself, can easily result in harming other folks, right? So if I don't know me, it's difficult to be in community, to be able to care for other persons. And I kind of learned that on the back end, right? Just in terms of how important it was to do this, this work of healing and understanding my journey. And that is, it has value, right? But only to the extent that I'm able to enter into a healing process so that it doesn't get into the way of the work that I'm doing with others, okay? So this idea of formation, like we're called to people, right? That's clear in the Bible, right? Jesus talks about, his call, right? To give sight to the blind. Jesus was very clear about, of course, this Trinitarian understanding. God knew what a mess creation was, right? If we don't see anything, and I'm not saying that derogatory, it's the complicated way in which we all have to live together in our unique differences, right? That everybody's not following the rules, right? And so the ways in which we try to create these sanitized understanding of our faith and our community, right, without having a sense of, to be able to reflect on what is a Christian understanding of human beings at minimum, right? So this idea of theological anthropology. Who are these people in my congregation? Who are these people, right? Not from the westernized, colonized understanding, right? I told you they reduced us a long time ago, right? And many people still feel bound by that reduction, okay? Which creates some of the suffering that we're seeing in our particular communities, right? They don't have a fuller sense of who they are. And sometimes we minimize that, right? You just have to be obedient to God and follow God's will and do some of those things that, frankly, when I was in my early stages of forming my own theology and spiritual practices, I was like, well, what does that mean doing the will of God, right? And so, some of the ways in which, as caring professionals, we need to have a fuller understanding of what it means to be human beings, particularly in a Christian sense, right? And so, there's plenty of things that the Bible has to say about us that represents the fullness, the uniqueness of who we are, and not necessarily, reducing us to these one ways of thinking about each other, because again, that would do a disservice to the people that we're a community with and that we are called to care for. We have to see them in their own unique sense. Of course, there are some things about the Christian faith that are, foundational to our faith. But, there's a whole lot of stuff that's in there, right? That doesn't necessarily reflect, right? Who we really are in those diverse ways of seeing us, right? This is all about suffering, right? This idea of mental health and how pastors are called to that, right? So there's an understanding of who I am, an understanding of humans, the uniqueness of who humans are, what they're bringing to the table, my curiosity to get to know people in the uniqueness and not based on my biased understanding of who I have universalized people to be, but that I am willing and curious to get to know this person that I have the privilege to care for, right? Or this community that I have to care for. But the essence of all of this is suffering. If you think about it, this call to salvation, right? That in some ways, when we think about mental health, right, we have to rethink that theology of salvation, right? And what that really means. And when we see the Bible, we see a lot of suffering. There's joy, there's celebration, there is good news, even in the midst of the suffering, right? But the essence of seeing all of this through suffering, right? So what that means is, as a pastor, I have to have a theodicy, right? What that means in the Greek, God, right? If in essence, what that means is God is so good, right? We say it all the time. God is good all the time, and God is good, right? Well, why is there so much suffering if God is so good? Why is there so much evil? Why did a young Black man who did not have any connection to Michigan State University, at least that I know of, I haven't followed up on the story. Some things I just have to protect myself from. I had a pastor who told me that if you're going to be a minister, you have to have a pulse on the world. So you need a major magazine, a major newspaper like Time or News USA Today, Washington Post. You need to be immersed in this news. A lot of times we say, oh, God told us not to be in it. You can't be in the world, you can't be of the world, or all of that way in which we misinterpret that scripture. But that to be in community, to be carers, we have to know what people are experiencing, not our reductionist idea that their life is solely relegated to this church community, right? And we know many people aren't even in church anyway, right? But there's life happening. Oftentimes news is a way for us to be exposed to that. Now social media, wow, we got access to so much information, it can be overwhelming. But the sense of, God, how did a young Black man, right? People are reducing it to access to guns and all these other kind of arguments that I don't think is going to change the violence, the gun violence that we're seeing across America and frankly in the world, right? But why did he do that? 3 innocent lives, right? We can see that with Sandy Hook, and we can see that at Charleston, right? These Black parishioners who are in there simply in Bible study, doing what they felt God, welcoming a stranger, and he takes all of them out, except for 3 people, right? Actually, the pastor's wife and his daughter, I think 3 people survived, right? She had questions, right? The church wasn't equipped to care for her or her granddaughter, right? In the midst of all of this death, right? And the things that you have to do to survive. God, where are you in that? Right? There's a good documentary on the Charleston, the aftermath of that, and the pastor of that church. There's been 2 pastors, I think, at this point, who talked about the need to be trauma informed, that in some ways the church wasn't equipped to respond to the survivors, right? So does that mean that if suffering is happening, God isn't good? Right? We say stuff like, God is trying to teach us something. This is because you've sinned and you've done something wrong. God is training us for something better, right? So we quote scriptures like, all things work for the good of God who are called according to God's purpose, right? So that everything that happens in life has a larger purpose, right? So minimizing the suffering and the extent of the meaning-making process that people experience in the darkness of life, right? And so not always willing, right? And the reality is we probably haven't had a whole lot of models that help us to connect to our feelings and our emotions, to walk us through the ability to talk out, to think, right? To feel, right? Many of us, and I only know this from my own experience from a Black family, and many of the people that I care for are mostly Black young adults, older adults at different phases of life. And almost all of us have at some points in our life had struggles with our feelings, being minimized, not seen in our families, right? You were a child, right? Children are to be seen and not heard. I don't care what you have to say. I'm the parent, I'm taking care of you, go to your room. Talked about corporal punishment, the ways in which parents, the authority that they have, right, to control children's behavior, right? Thinking that they're protecting them, right? A lot of people, even as they share with me, don't feel safe. They don't feel like they can trust. Most of that stuff comes out of childhood, and that we see it being repeated through our relationships, not knowing that, right? We don't have access to the information. I'm clear, I've been trained, I got a lot of knowledge that has opened my eyes, and that many people don't have the privilege of that. They know what they know, right? This reduced sense of themselves, and therefore the eyes that they're going to use is a reduced sense of other persons, right? So we do need to take advantage of spaces where we can share knowledge and create a different kind of spiritual formation that's about how we connect to one another, right? So theodicy, we need to have a sense of theodicy, right? God is good, but God was clear, right? I'm giving you dominion over the earth, right? We see the messiness in scripture, right? It doesn't mean God isn't good, but again, that's our theology, right? Because a lot of people struggle with that, right? They've been taught that God is good. And therefore, when things happen, and they always do, right? Some people will go away from God because it's not the God that they were taught about in Sunday school, right? It's not the Jesus, right? They don't have conversations. They have not been a part of this way in understanding the hurt and harms that we can inflict on each other. So what do, right? Sometimes we say it's because of the devil, right? Or sometimes evil, right? How many, I mean, we could go on Facebook. And perhaps that's some of the things I have said, that I grew up in evangelical church. No, I'm not that anymore, but well, maybe I am, but that's not my theology, right? I'm clear, right? I am a trauma survivor in my home, okay? Only in my adult life come to the place where that is no longer a source of shame for me, right? My family was filled with domestic violence. At a women's retreat, I had the courage. I was tired as I was being called to ministry and being exposed to all of these spaces where people were so honest about what they were happening in their lives and wanting healing. I had never been exposed to an environment like that, right? And I was just in awe of the authenticity and the courage to share. And I shared. And I said, this is what happened to me. I carried that shame for most of my adult life. And 3 well-meaning senior friends of mine who were mentors in my church at a retreat took me to a small chapel and said, we need you to lay on this pew. And they began to cast out the demon inside of me. And I laid there, right? Because at one point, you know, growing up in a Pentecostal denomination, the laying on of hands and healing and all of that stuff had value to me. And that always makes sense of it. I understand there's a mystery of this thing called Christianity, right? The mystery to our faith, things that we don't know, signs and wonders. I'm a firm believer that those things are happening, but also that we also can understand the particularities of our experience mean more than a demon inside of me. So I sat there and I left and I felt so confused by what had happened. They were like, oh, praise God, you're free, you're liberated. I am still on the journey to heal those hurts and harms from my family. I'm in a much better place on my healing and have just accepted the reality that it is lifelong, right? That there are stages of healing, how I understand myself, my own self-esteem, my own courage to use my voice, right? To live into this thing in life without fear, without worried about what people are going to think about me, and am I going to get rejected? All of that stuff, all of those ways get nurtured in our families, and we live that out. We think education and all of that stuff covers it, but those things are just protective factors to help us survive. So I understand what that journey is like, and I've had to think about my own theodicy. My sister died at 12. My mother left the church because she did not get care. She's lost 2 children, right? And while she was a wonderful example of a woman who worked, I can't tell you, she died one day short of a week shy of her 60th birthday of breast cancer, was a smoker most of her life. And I know more about her after her death than I did in her death, and just a lot of the suffering that she had to go through and the ways in which she coped, right? Smoking, busyness, right? Taking care of all of her children, right? We didn't want for anything, but she didn't have the emotional capacity to care for us, to take care of us, our emotional selves, right? And so, you know, many of us in my family, we struggle with that, right? Weight gain and all that other kind of stuff where it was just about survival, go to work, busyness. And what do? We reinforce that in our churches, right? We don't have a good sense of how that connects to our lived reality, right? There's no space to talk about some of those things because many of our families, we were told to keep it in our homes, right? Not talk about it. Theodicy, here's Jesus. When he saw the crowds, the feeding of the 5,000, he had just done a bunch of ministry, and we see this in several of the Gospels, right? The Synoptic Gospels, told in different ways, but essentially capturing the essence of who Jesus was, right? Who am I, right? How do I understand this thing of suffering, right? He had compassion on them, right? Because they were harassed and helpless like a sheep without a shepherd. This is my go-to scripture, right? And the woman at the well too, the living water. Many people reduce her to a prostitute and not this woman who is culturally bound in how we understand that scripture, but that what it means to constantly open yourself up to love, right? And still be rejected and not, you know, have a sense of what that feels like, right? So Jesus knew that, named it, but gave her hope, right? One of the central evangelists in the gospel and people reduce her to a prostitute, right? I can't tell you how many sermons I heard about that, but I had to humanize her. What is Jesus saying to her? And many of us who have yearned to be loved and accepted, right? To understand what that feels like, water that we can drink, a resource that vitalizes and revitalizes us. But in the same way, wow, compassion, right? Understanding the nature, I talked about it yesterday, the oppression that still exists in our society that directly affects our mental health and our well-being, okay? But he knew it, right? We know that's why Jesus came, right? Jesus knew what was going on. I had a bigger view, not just reducing folk to suffering, although we see that as he ministered one by one to the various individuals, but there were witnesses to that, his disciples and other people. That's why the crowds were coming, right? That's why there was genuine, authentic healing, deliverance, whatever we want to call it, going on in Jesus' ministry that caught the attention of folk, right? The disciples didn't always get it, but eventually they did, right? And so do we get it, right? Do we get the fuller understanding of why people are the way that they are, okay? It's in the book. It really is. But what do we do? Here's the what do we do, right? The vocation of a counselor. Okay, Dr. Trina, I hear you. I see all the suffering in my church. There are times when I'm helpless. I don't know what to do with. Maybe I am a prayer. Maybe I am, deterministic. Go do this. Maybe I have said, that's because you ain't living right. Or that's because God is trying to teach you something. Or God's got a better plan for your life. Maybe I have been guilty of saying that. There's always a different way of seeing and doing things that are more life-giving and humane and compassionate, that recognizes the reality that the suffering that people are experiencing is not their own. But we make them responsible for the healing. I'm clear that that's how I lived most of my life, right? It's my fault, right? Here's the shame. So I got to be responsible. I can't tell nobody, and I am responsible for this. The stuff that my mother took to the grave that I've been privy to now through conversations with my aunt, who's one of the few remaining family members, just made me so sad and sick. And that she lived her life wanting to help other people in spite of the suffering. So the tension that we live, right, we can hold it and at the same time be available to whatever God's call on our life. But she didn't live until she was 60 or barely 60, right? So it had a profound effect on her well-being and her health, okay? And so it's in the book. Well, what's in the book, right? We can't reduce life to little scripture points, right? Although we do. Right, we know that this is captured in a whole larger sense of culture, community. God is saying something to us in that, right? And I say the DSM too. You guys, many of you who were familiar with the DSM, has over 500 psychological diagnoses in there, right? Right, a lot of people, who have been harmed and hurt. In fact, I just think that a lot of people don't really read the Bible anyway, right? It's a complex book. Right? It has a lot of stuff in there, 66 chapters, a whole lot of stuff is going on in that Bible, okay? So it can be rather daunting and overwhelming. So we need to be, kind and compassionate and patient with folks as we walk them through it, right? I have the privilege of doing theological education, but not everybody has had to do that. Bible study helps, but again, just being, understanding that people don't really always know, and they're just repeating what other people have said to them, right? We call that, passing down those, unhelpful ways of trying to make sense of things, right? The DSM, so neither one of these books are harmful, right? You have the DSM with all of these psychological diagnoses. They do help us understand what people are experiencing, although it doesn't put people in a context, right? It reduces people to their diagnosis, and so therefore their identity is part of their diagnosis. I have PTSD, I have OTSD, or I'm bipolar, or I'm this, right? So they see themselves through these symptoms that they experience, and then we reinforce it with medication and some of those things. I have to be honest with you, I have had medication over the course of my life, situational, when I lost my mom and when I was going through a PhD program and I had a lot of anxiety, experienced a lot of sadness and depression, that I'm clear was a normal part of the grieving process, but was reduced to pathology. Something is wrong with you because you're grieving, right? You need to be strong. Your faith is weak because you're not handling it, right? So many of us Black women live in the context of the strong Black woman. One of my students talked about that in one of the presentations yesterday. And we have ongoing conversations about that. One of my colleagues wrote a book, Too Heavy a Yoke, Black Women and the Burden of Strength, and how that gets reinforced in our churches. Black women are the majority in Black churches, are the worker bees, right? Because objectification, our value is what we can do, right? And so we don't always take care of ourselves because we are trying to experience some value, right? We don't always leave our families with a sense of value and worth. And so we try to get it in ways that sometimes aren't helpful and can be exploited and taken advantage of in the way that we were on the plantation. So understanding womanist theologies and more life-giving ways of living out my Christian faith, and many of us who are drawn to that theology, has resulted in some ways healthier ways of being in the world that's not about sacrifice, right? And so the DSM is helpful, right? But we have to put it into context, right? It's just a starting point, okay? All right, this whole thing about mental health, right? That mental health counselors, right? It's more than reducing folk to the things that we're seeing, the symptoms, right? We know OCD, ADHD, PTSD, whole bunch of acronyms to that stuff, right? Essentially, mental health is this, right? It's our emotional, psychological, spiritual, and social well-being, right? It affects how we think, feel, act, right? It also helps determine how we handle stress. Talked about that yesterday. How we handle stress is often the result, the consequences are on a lot of the diseases that we're seeing in our bodies. But what do? We reduce it to the diseases, and doctors aren't helpful in helping us to put us in context, right? So the integration, right? We don't, as religious folks, we don't always integrate, some people fear psychology or sociology or anthropology and all the ways of knowing that exist, right? Not seeing that perhaps God is in that too, right? God is revealing the complexities of creation, right? So I've had to start paying attention to neuroscience and the way that the brain is impacted and how foods, right, determine our mental health. We don't always talk about that. A lot of our folks live in food deserts and that they don't have access to healthy foods in the ways that processed foods affect our mental health. And not only obesity and some of those things, but it has a direct effect on our mental health. But we don't talk about that because we're so focused on the diagnosis. And frankly, in church, we're focused on the sin, right? Having a reductionist understanding of what that means in a way that we don't see the fullness of what's happening in people's lives. So we have to have a fuller understanding of what it means to be mental health counselors, okay? I love the wellness wheel, right? It's helped me to get a fuller sense of, I'm not just a spiritual being, right? My emotional, social, occupational, financial, environmental, physical, intellectual, all that stuff is who I am. And matters to my mental health, right? I have so many people trying to thrive and live a life of flourishing. So many of us, right? I'm trying to pay mine off, right? We don't talk about the weight of student loans for those of us who felt like we needed to get education to compete, to have some sort of validation of who we are, and yet we might not have had the finances. Many people are in debt, hundreds of thousands of dollars, $200,000. And yet that does contribute to the way in which you can flourish and feel healthy and live in some of these other domains. So it is holistic, right? Not only a view of ourselves, but how we are living in the holistic sense of the world, our communities, and all of these things that have a direct effect on our mental health. So we need to have an understanding of that before we, right, try to care for what is in our midst, okay? And so just really coming up to a fuller understanding of some of those things. These are the most common mental health. This is what most people are gonna see. You may not see this, and again, this is DSM stuff, right? The labeling of suffering, right? Depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, panic disorder, or OCD, that's the one common of that. Bipolar, right? The shifting ranges of highs and lows, right? This way in which I can be super energetic, and the next minute I can have a deep depression and won't get out of bed. That's not me, I don't have that diagnosis, but many people do come, right? And sometimes we do have that shift in, okay, I'm happy, and the next day it's like, oh my God, I can't get out of bed, I don't wanna go to work, right? So the sense that shifting does happen, right? ADHD is not on there, that's always ascribed to our young folks. And many of them were raised in homes where there was a lot of trauma. Like I said, I've had a lot of suffering. There's only 3 siblings left in my family. My youngest brother died of schizophrenia in 2020 at the height of the pandemic. He died of suicide. He was schizophrenic for most of his life. We didn't know it, right? He did present, symptoms, if you will, but I would say it was a reflection. I know what my family was. I know I lived in that family. We were 8 years apart, but and so we didn't grow up in a whole lot of time together. But I know that context, right? And so he was also in the military, and so some ways that profound sense of escaping into an alternate reality is safe. The world is scary. People are scary. So our brains have this wonderful ability to escape, right? We call it schizophrenia. We shame people who are alternate voices, or the soloists. I don't know if you all saw a movie with Jamie Foxx and how he was so talented of a violinist, yet grew up on some of the most horrific circumstances, trauma, not in addition to the racist stuff that we have to deal with. It is no wonder we escape into alternate realities of fantasy, daydreaming. The most extreme version of that is schizophrenia. They call it dissociative identity disorder now, right? There's a name for everything. But it describes this experience of how we have the ability to escape from a scary reality. And we're criticized my brother. We talked about him, and at times it was really scary, right? A lot of anger, aggression. And that's protection, right? To keep himself safe. To us, he was crazy, right? He had to live with that suffering. He had 3 adult children, was about to be a grandfather in a week, and he took his own life. I still feel immense guilt about not being able to help him, right? Not having enough knowledge early on to provide that sense of security. So many people are taking their lives because they don't have enough protective factors, meaning community, people who love them, a sense of meaning and purpose, right? So they only see they're isolated, right? And even in families, they're isolated. So this way in which there are not enough protective factors, not even from society, right? So you can see how it's increasing among young Black people, because they're having to compare themselves to others who say they got life going on, and yet they feel like they're less than, they don't have any worth and value. They've heard that most of their life, right? And so the ways in which people don't feel like they have any value, right? Dementia, we know that's a neurological disorder, but there's a lot of things about how we maintain healthy brain, how we exercise our brains, and the things that we do to have longevity, and sometimes the reflection of how people live their lives, right? This constant shifting that's happen, right? To help ourselves feel safe results, unfortunately, in Alzheimer's and dementia, okay? And then all of the fear that exists, right? Because if you grow up in a society or homes that aren't safe, right? This fear of something that could happen, we call it anxiety or OCD or social anxiety. But the reality of it is I don't feel safe. I don't trust that anybody can keep me safe because I don't have an experience of it. So the way that I survive and protect myself is I'm afraid, so I try to work it out in my mind to keep myself safe. But what that ultimately means is I cannot be present in the reality of my life, right? So there's a fuller understanding of all of this. Ministers is helpful, right? There are a lot of great organizations that I have compiled a documentation to share you all with some of this stuff that's now becoming more accessible. It's not that you have to become a therapist, but it is important that we know just enough to have a fuller understanding of what people might be experiencing. Ton of really great books that make this information successful, and I'll be happy to share a bibliography with you all. So you can familiarize yourself with some of these things. This is what people are coming with, right? If they fear, a lot of times they're not coming with this stuff at all. They go to churches and act like they have it all together. Oh, I'm fine. Because the church often isn't safe to be that kind of authentic, right? Because if you're not perfect, the sense that I have to be perfect, this perfect Christian, right? You're going to be judged, you're going to be criticized. Nobody's going to sign up for that. So what do? We keep this stuff. I know that was my struggle, right? And I have, frankly, experienced a lot of rejection, a lot of criticism as I'm becoming more authentic with my feelings and my emotions. People ain't ready for that because they're not ready with their own. So I get shamed a lot of times for being emotional. I've been told I was too sensitive, too this, too that. I don't care about that stuff now. I'm being more authentic, which results in flourishing a vital life, right? I feel good about myself. It just means I have to create a relationship with people who are also wanting to do that, right? How many of those people are in our churches or in our communities or in our families, right? We got shame for experiencing our emotions. And so it's not safe if people are gonna, not see you. So, keep those things in mind about how much people are coming in with a fear to be authentic because it's not who they believe they're supposed to be, right? So this idea of how do we care? How do we counsel? It's not just about the room. There is an aspect of that, but how can we cultivate these ways of seeing in our communities in general, right? So that we can cultivate relationships. So in some ways, pastors aren't completely responsible for all of that. There's particular context, like for me as a therapist or as a chaplain, but I am a part of, other communities where I try to cultivate this sense of either by example or in places where I have the opportunity to speak and share knowledge, the committees that I own, how I model that in my own life and in my relationships and on my organizations. So this idea of mental health is so much more expansive than sending folk to a therapist, okay? All right, just, so how do I do this, right? We need trauma-informed ministry for one, just the realization that trauma is the culprit in a lot of stuff, right? Remember, it's not how we interpret the trauma, right? I have a slide that kind of gets at some of that stuff. Acknowledging, right, as you think about how to do this mental health well, we got to acknowledge the reign of human hurts and harms. Evil is inside of us, right? And a lot of times we're conflicting evil because of the lack of self-esteem and the horrific damage that children had to be exposed to, right? I've been an insider to all of that. I'm an insider for my own life and my family. The fact that any of us in my family are flourishing at all is a miracle, right? But as a chaplain, as a therapist, I've seen it, right? And to be able to hold all of that and still have some faith in humanity that we could be healthy and whole and live a life of flourishing. It's Brian Stevenson says we are more than the worst thing that we've ever done, right? So we also have to see ourselves as not just individuals that I have to take care of, but I've done a lot of that, but now I'm exposing myself to different communities that we are together are, healing and trying to flourish in ways that we can be accountable and to receive mutual support from one another. But we are all part of systems of family and all of those things. So, just keep some of those things in mind. I think we need to rethink our theology of sin. I know I've had to, right? Everything, again, it's just, if you capture all of the previous slides, it's not just about behavior, right? Picking apart the scriptures and say, this is what you've done wrong, right? But to see people in a fuller experience of their lives, understanding psychological diagnosis, but not reducing people to it, okay? Normalize instead of stigmatize. So if you're going to do this counseling well, science isn't the problem. We know they've been, guilty with classifications and all of that. The DSM is a product of that. The way in which some human bodies, weren't really human, right? So know that their stigmatization has contributed to a lot of ways that we see each other and maybe not even knowing it. And I think while it's helpful to have all this full knowledge, we really do have to have the context of a person's life and see them. So although we see them as problems, oftentimes we see people as to be fixed, right? And blaming the person for what happened, like addicts. And, really the addiction is about self-soothing trauma, right? Trying to cope with pain, right? But we call them addicts and we dismiss them. And sometimes their life is reflected, right? Because they don't feel seen and heard, hopelessness. So you see a lot of people who are homeless, but addicts are in our home as well. And that's how people cope, but we reduce them to addicts, right? And not understanding that it's about coping. The magnitude of suffering, I already said that, right? Do we ever wonder why so many people are suffering, right? What's in the water, right? I already said it, we have to not reduce people to problems to be fixed, right? A lot of people, and I can be very critical sometimes of the interpretation of the Bible, and the problem with the Bible itself, but sometimes the interpretation of it, right, doesn't reflect the complex nature of humans. It's very reductionist, right? So he's seen a complexity of human beings. Part of that is enfranchising grief and loss. A lot of grief is disenfranchised, not about death. We don't understand all of the ways in which people experience loss, right? In fact, a lot of human suffering is a result of the various losses that people have experienced over their life. You see it in this, to demonstrate in some ways that disenfranchising means silence and creating places in people's lives that are invisible, that they are trying to make meaning out of this respective experiences, don't have ways of ritualizing it are naming it. And so really to have a better understanding of loss and grief, right? That sometimes it's not about depression. Sometimes it's simply about loss. And who am I now in the face of this loss? Okay. Empathy, compassion, right? That's the essence of this mental health stuff, right? Sure, there's a lot of stuff about training and listening and learning how to do this work well, but at the essence, it's about empathy and compassion, helping people to be seen, heard, and validated. That means acknowledging feelings and emotions, reckoning with shame and guilt. I lived most of my life under that umbrella, needing to be seen because we weren't seen in our families as human beings who had a voice, something to bring, living a life of worth and value. Many people don't have that. How can we empower that, encourage that without objectifying or exploiting people, but that living into their already God's sense of who they are and their own unique skills and talents and what they can contribute. Questioning if one is loved. You'd be surprised how many people live outside of themselves, right, to get that love, right? It's so subtle, right? Self-criticism, right? We're beating ourselves up for our choices because we've been shamed a lot in our lives, right? And so, internalizing some of the criticism that has happened over the course of our life, right? Especially what it means to be Black, right? And having to deal, we call them voices, to be controlled and all that other kind of stuff. But it's really just this fuller understanding of, just really seeing the value of who we are, right? And not having the capacity to do that. And a lot of people just don't have a voice, right? They can't make decisions, so they're stuck in their life, right? And so a lot of that stuff, comes from just not being able to make decisions. A lot of life is control. You do this, you do that, and not giving people the capacity to make decisions in their lives. So when you see the range of things, a lot of it is a result of some of these things. Again, I'm not reducing more than I'm giving you a sense of what I've seen in my work, what I've experienced in myself, what I can now name. And some of the things that I'm healing so that I can live, a little bit more freer and liberated, right? So what does a holistic mental health ministry look like? Again, it's not about the room. Yes, I do believe in referrals, but I think you need to be careful about that. Not all counselors are adequate or equipped. Just because we have the training does not mean anything. So I think we need to be careful about who we refer our folks to. So this, in essence, a lot of this is in the realm of pastoral care and counseling, but increasingly, especially for African-American folks, is sort of this communal care. How do we take care of each other? I've shared a bunch of resources with you where that very thing has happened. Ma'afa celebrations, healing circles, ways in which people are presenting in activism work, social justice, trying to change systems. So all the work is not in the therapy room, okay? Preaching, how do we preach sermons that's not shaming? Right. I've heard plenty of those where you're not doing this because you're not doing that. Right. Those are dismissive. And so really preaching, Otis Moss is a really good model of that. Has a couple of books that talk about ways in which we can preach in the face of injustice and sorrow, empowering people in their unique gifts without exploiting them. And there's this idea of fellowship and social interaction. We need it. We're communal people. The pandemic kind of messed that up. But we need fellowship and social interaction so that we can learn healthier ways of being with one another. And a lot of suffering as a result of, human relationships with people that we trusted, right? And feeling betrayed. And the only way to heal from some of that is to create spaces and to talk about some of this stuff. So we got to talk about some of this stuff in our spaces, got to teach. I'm becoming more of a social advocate, wanting to do things more on social media. I can't even tell you how much junk I'm seeing on that. Being in spaces, right, where it's not just about helping people in the room, that I have a fuller effect on how we can focus. Now, we're reducing it just to mental health, but it really is about the collective sense of how we live a life of flourishing, how we can thrive, and how mental health is a central aspect of that. But it's more of a holistic way of understanding ourselves. And here's the deal with a decolonizing mindset, right? I talked a little bit about that yesterday, right? And it's just acknowledging, right, that the role of trauma has impacted the way that we see ourselves and function in our ministries, and that we, live a life that's more aligned with our, communal sense of self, our connection to one another, right? And that it is mostly communal, right? That we're doing this work together. We're not feeling like it's all alone, right? And how we can partner with each other in a way that we don't feel like it's our responsibility to do that, okay? So that's it, right? I'll be happy to take your questions. And hopefully we can have some really good dialogue for the time that we have.
All righty. I have just put a note in the chat that if you have a question for Dr. Trina, as she is affectionately called, please place it in the chat. I will ask her the question. While y'all are, see, Dr. Adams was already getting ahead of it. He put a couple of things about a holistic theology of liberation with a question mark after it. And then the question before that was the role of theology as a
theosology, right? Theos, the Greek word for God, ology, understanding of God, right? Yeah, what does that mean, right? Who is God, right? Is God a God of liberation? Remember, we have to think about historically how we were. I think our African ancestors had a sense of God, right? This African ecology, right? So the more that I've immersed myself in that history, the more I'm clear. We came into this country with they told us all that they wanted, and maybe some people were subjected to that, the ways in which that was imposed, this idea of God as, this father that was punitive, and then if you were disobedient, you were going to be punished, right? But boy, our sense of survival was really a liberation theology. So the ways in which some of our academics, and mostly in the realm of the academy, have written about liberation theology, womanist theology, reframing the Exodus in a way, because I've had the pastor say, we couldn't see ourselves in the Bible without a different interpretation of freedom and liberation, to see God as a God of liberation, right? The holistic part is that with an understanding that it's in the realm of suffering. Because if we just focus on the freedom and the victory of the cross, right, we rush to get to Sunday, but we're not recognizing how many people were grieved and were sorrowed. And so there is this sense of holistic liberation, to see ourselves as fully human, right? That's what God did when he came in the person of Jesus, right? God came in the person of Jesus, right, to be fully human, right? So we got a chance to witness that, but we don't always. So this holistic, right, theology of liberation, I don't know if that's something, is the question, sis, do we need it? And I think that I would say yes. And I think that some of the ways in which we're thinking about that, I think the holistic part doesn't always include the body, the way that the body works, and the implication of that on our theology. So there's an increasing way in which, that needs to be factored in. I'm writing a book on invisibility, where I'm actually trying to capture that holistic ways of thinking about our God selves and how we live that out in the world. In our relationships. All right.
All right. Reverend Tracy asks, can you speak to the importance of not imposing our understanding of God theology on those we provide care?
And Reverend Tracy, I know you've done some CPEs, so you could probably answer that question. She was a former student of mine. And also I'm still on the same ministerial staff, but so that this is so important, right? We oftentimes, our understanding of God is our understanding of God, and the imposition of that is that we impose that. We don't recognize that people have their own unique experience and understanding of God's. And oftentimes the understanding of God is imposed even in churches, right? Not giving people the freedom to think about God. That means a core sense of theology and who God is, but there's so much, we can see that in the many names of God, the many functions of God, right? God is much more than the way sometimes we can limit our understanding and imaging of God. And I think we do a disservice for that, right? People want easy answers. They don't want to do the work. And I'm saying that probably in error, but they don't have the capacity or the space to believe that they can do that kind of work, right? A lot of times we've been given stuff over our life and think that's the way it is, instead of introducing a process of becoming that people could be empowered to do that work and feel like they're supported in. But the harm is the imposition, right? And if we don't acknowledge, right, the unique ways in which people are asking questions in the context of their lives and their experiences, we can do more harm, right? And frankly, it doesn't work, right? I mean, for some people who are used to just taking stuff and running with it, but even then, right, they're probably not going to feel empowered to make sense of things themselves. So in clinical pastoral education, where many of us were trained to be chaplains, it is a big part of our training, right? We have to meet people where they are in the context of their own experiences and their own understanding of God. Sure, in some ways, if it's harmful, right, there is space to do that kind of reflective work where we're helping people to see that it's not what their experiences is not aligned with what they're believing, right? So they believe one thing, but it's not reflective in their experience. And so working with people in a way where that they can reflect on that and come to that conclusion themselves instead of me leading them to that.
All right. Dr. Adams asks, what does the holistic ministry / vision look like in today's Black church and in specific Black Methodism?
Oh, Dr. Adams, I am Black Methodism. Yeah, you don't want my answer. I always say we have to kind of trash and then start all over, but that's not nice. I think, just being more, and I say some of that in the slides, I think just sort of reductionist way of ministry has become even more increasingly capitalistic with the onset of the mega church movement and the ways that a lot of ministry is modeled after organizations. So you see that in a lot of our trainings, and it's all about, raising money and funds and some of those things. So the shift, we saw that kind of shift in our the evolution of the church, and the Black church is really a liberating church in some ways. It probably has to succumb, to some of the capitalistic, right, ways of thinking about ministry, right? Which means if you shift that way, you're not gonna think so much about people. When we are all being affected by capitalism, they call it neo-capitalism now, the survival of the fittest. And if you ain't there, you don't have the education, and you're gonna get lost. Nobody's gonna care for you. But that's Western individualism, right? Survival of the fittest is just being acted out in different, right? So I think that the church in some ways is, this is a simplistic, optimistic way of viewing, but I think it's in the word, right? But the implications of that is, what does it mean not to think, right, from an economic perspective, but to see the essence of human beings and meeting them where they're at. I'm a firm believer, if you meet people where they're at, they're gonna give. Right, we give them a reason to give, the sense of mission and purpose, right? People are looking for that, but not when they get beat over the head and not when they get reduced to sinners, right? That it is a part that people can give joyfully and contribute to the larger mission of the church that is about something other than the church, right? So the sense of mission and giving back to other people, not just giving out turkeys, but being in community with people in a way that we can touch and see like Jesus did, is in the word.
All right. Dr. Baker asks, how can we include mental health ministries in the local church?
Yeah, there's all kind of books on that. And I'm kind of, at first I was like, yeah, we need a mental health ministry. I think what we need is a mental health sensibility, right? So I kind of talked about it in one slide where mental health, this idea of our well-being, right? Now all those different facets of our life, how can we incorporate that more holistic kind of ministry where we are learning, right? It's not sort of about the healing and being delivered from sin. And so these are some of the common things that I've heard and people come to me with, the challenges of some of those things. But it is a holistic self, that mental health is who we are when we enter the door. So how can I be healthy as a mom or a dad or a grandmother in my relationship? So how can I think differently about my health or have more education about that, right? What would be some of those things that we can hear from the pulpit? A lot of times that's ministry, right? And then it's Bible study. But even those are opportunities for us to really think more holistically about who we are as humans. How do we handle stress, right? How do we talk about childhood abuse? How do we talk about grief and loss, right? That's mental health, right? And so it's not just the problems, that the anxiety and depression. Let's talk about that, reframing it in ways that we make it a part of our life together, right? So yeah, I'm okay with mental health ministries, but again, we're reducing it to a part of the church and not making it a central part of whatever it is to do life together as Christians in the midst of suffering. We're not shying away from that. Even, having opportunities to be connected to culture in a way that we can talk realistically about what that means and how we can be better stewards with this life that we have as we live it together, right? And so for me, I just see it as incorporated in the whole of our church communities and how we do this together.
Okay, Reverend Don Phillips asks, white supremacy has categorized the spirituality that derived from Black and Brown people as evil. There are ways in which Black Christianity has embraced this idea. How do we help our people reclaim a sense of our history and our unique spiritual, psychological, and embodied selves and strip away the colonized lens of our heritage?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I would say that essentially has been my journey. I don't think it's overt. I think the church, the Black church, has been a wonderful refuge for Black people. The hush harbor, I would say, if you don't know about the hush harbor, that's where we stealed away from the gaze of the white folks. Yeah. We don't know how to get out of this. Some of us tried to run away, but we made it our own. We went into the hush harbor and danced and shouted all of those things that were part of who our identity as Africanness. We were able to live that out, right? So how much have we gotten away from that? I think the colonization, the ways in which some of those identities have been imposed on us, the individuality, the ways in which we've been made to compete against each other. What is beauty, right? The old journey with our hair, and what is bodies, and all those kind of things are those subtle ways in which whiteness has, even our relationships with one another, right? This idea of competition, and only so many people are afforded spots, right? But that we all really have the capacity to do it once we understand who we are. So I think it's intentionally talking about that. Trinity United Church of Christ has been wonderful at that. There's another church in Atlanta that does a wonderful job with spirituality. There's other cultural ways. The Association of Black Psychologists do a lot of stuff with that. There's chapters in most of the metropolitan cities. I'm part of the Chicago, and just doing things with rituals and educating us on African values and rituals and places and understanding of ourselves, right? To understand a different. So there's ways. I think pilgrimages. I know everybody can't afford that, but again, this idea of mission. How can we not just build a bigger church, but to invest in people so that they can have a better understanding of themselves towards liberation? So are we making investments in the right thing, right? Reading, boy, all of this stuff is so accessible to us, right? Documentaries, this stuff is coming alive, so we now have access to it, right? But we need leaders, right? Because people are looking for that kind of leadership to see themselves as other than problems, right? As other than, these Black people who have no value or not human. We need leaders who can also realize that in themselves, right? So I think that there's so many different ways that, and I got a whole bunch of resources I can share with you guys, people who are doing some wonderful stuff. We just don't know about it, right?
All right, so we can stay on schedule. Time for one more question. As we are in this changing world, how can we balance the biblical approach and the scientific approach of healing mental issues?
I'm sorry, what was that question?
How can we balance the biblical and scientific approaches of healing mental issues?
They are more integrated than what we think, right? We want to reduce science to science and theology or Bible to Bible, but I have a really wonderful book on the bibliography that I'm going to share that talks about the compatibility of the two, right? People thought Jesus was a demon, right? When he was doing some of his ministry. We heard Jesus cast out demons. We see grief, we see loss, we see anxious, right? Sometimes they name, don't be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication, make your request known to God, and the peace of God who transcends all understanding will guide your heart and your mind in Christ Jesus. Why are y'all worrying Matthew 6? Why are y'all worrying about tomorrow? When today, be present in today. So it's in the word. It's in terms of how we understand, right? The Bible reflects the complexity of humans and how we live this life, right? Theology is psychology is getting at the suffering and naming it in different ways. Our ability to see it in the word with new language is the power, right? It's there. There is no difference, right? Grief and loss is all up in there. Harm, trauma, right? And it invites us to have conversations about how we're living that in the present, name it without relegating it to secrecy. And so science has a lot to say with us when it's used in responsible ways, right? We know science hasn't been good to us as Black folk, but we've had Black folks who are redeeming it and reclaiming it in a way that it does have some value, not just to Black people, but marginalized communities in general. So we know that we have the capacity, and that's always been the case, right? We just haven't gotten credit for it, right? And so once we understand the fullness of our history and the ways in which we've contributed, right? That means we gotta do some work in getting to know that, our ancestor. I just learned that I had an ancestor who was part of the Elaine massacres, and he was mentioned in the whole book, and I didn't know that because my family didn't say anything about it, right? Robert Lee, he was an activist for sharecroppers, and they burned, killed a lot of Black folks like Tulsa and some of these other areas. And so to know that, right, gives me a fuller sense of identity, that we're just not these lazy people that they claim, but the things that we're seeing in our community is a result of trauma, right? And the ways in which our colonization of seeing ourselves as problems, sometimes we can reflect that same kind of oppressive ways of thinking and being on each other, right? There's power in that. Let's not forget that, right? So it's being more compassionate, more humble, more have a sense of humility and a willingness, right, to understand ourselves more deeper so that we can understand each other. Okay, so it's very compatible. It's just how we learn how to integrate the two. We got a lot of questions, y'all, and I don't have enough time.
Yeah, our time is up. You're done. You done. All right. There's still some things in the chat. Maybe if you want to hang on and maybe address them privately, you can. But thank you, Dr. Trina Armstrong. Louisville Seminary did a good thing in hiring you. Thank you for sharing with us yesterday and today, and for all of your collaboration in this consultation. We are about to take a pause for the cause and take a break, and we will be back at 10:10 with Dr. Kauser ready to do the introduction for our next plenary speaker.
And I'm gonna send you all resources that I have about different communities who are doing some wonderful work. And also I have a bibliography, some great resources that could be helpful in some of our ministries and wherever we're at doing this work. And so I'll get those to the leaders so they can share that information with you all. So hopefully you'll have a fuller sense of the communities who are really trying to do some great work to kind of set us free. See some of the questions that oh, that's a good question. Just wondering about how other ways to reframe mental health issues. I think just to normalize that's a word, the mental health, but I'm just saying, like, to normalize it. Sometimes in the context of like well-being wheels and, just really helping people to think about how they handle stress, how they grieve losses, without making a mental health issue, but that it's a life issue, right? Do people feel like they can grieve, or how are people feeling about their emotions, right? How they can express their emotions, how they, can talk about their own histories, right? The things that they have experienced. So I think just normalizing, just what it means to live in general is a way to get at it without saying, this is a mental health issue, right? It's really a life issue, right? So just using some of those terms that we already have. Church hurt, yeah. It's a big one. I gotta name it. For one, for church hurt, a lot of people are hiding behind theology, don't have a way of doing that kind of personal reflection. Sometimes, again, if you want to admit to any failings or weakness, sometimes that could be a risk, because I think Black folks, somebody said it earlier, our power, we put folks on a pedestal, and so that's why when folks fall, we're having a heart, as if they're God themselves, and so we're not. I think a lot of pastors and religious leaders just don't feel like they feel safe enough to be authentic and real, and as a part, again, as their formation, right? And so if they don't do that work, and it's all about the power, right? A lot of people, the power is addictive, right? When people are vulnerable, so everybody comes to the church as vulnerable, and some people get taken advantage of that. And so, and some people will never get it. And I think just having leaders who they're accountable to, who, and some, I've seen it in some instances where people have had hard and they, sent them to a therapist, but sometimes it's the systemic nature of ministry and what we have to do, I think is the biggest issue, right? Without reducing it to that one person, but seeing it's a systemic thing and how some of these things actually get hidden and protected, right? And just get repeated in cycles. And so until we really address it systemically, what it means to be whole and healthy and, our healing, our sense of self, some of the things that we've gone through, we're just setting ourselves up in a cycle of these things are going to just keep repeating. At minimum, therapy is one best, but I think we need to think more holistically about how these systems can change. So they are giving us opportunities to be flourish, understand, what this Christian life is all about. And without that, I don't think that much of this stuff is going to change. Well, I think that's the part of it. I think really understanding like outside help, why outside help is such an authority and not what it means to cultivate relationships with people, right? So I wouldn't call it a life issue more, so generally speaking life issues, but helping people to name grief and loss, right, would be one of the more obvious examples, like in what that does, how it contributes to a diagnosis of depression. But what does it really mean to lose somebody and how your life could really shift based on that loss? So I think that is life in itself, but specifically talking about experiences more explicitly. Because we sometimes, in some ways that I think seeing the counseling space and therapists as the people who are responsible for carrying or fixing some of this stuff. And that is a fallacy of what we do as therapists. Some therapists feel they do that, but we really create spaces for people to share their experiences, to feel seen and heard, because most people come therapy don't feel like people see them, right? See them as problems to go to a therapist and not are willing to sit with them, to understand, to hear what they have to say. And a lot of times just having that space, we can come to the conclusion about our own internal resources. Sometimes we just need to sit in the feelings and emotions and not feel like everything is something that we have to send to a therapist. I've been doing this work for 20 years and have just come to the conclusion that we do have our own inherent resources. We need the language to name what it is that we're experiencing. So therapists really aren't all that, just we all have our ways of doing this work, and some of us have been trained in different ways. But is that another way of saying, go away, somebody else could fix you? So I think we have to be careful about that and just be more experts at, people's life experiences and who they are bringing as their unique selves and what brings them to that moment where they're feeling that thing, right? To be more curious about that. Because it is uncomfortable to sit with people who are in pain. And so we have to reckon with that ourselves, right? What does that mean to hear? And I think a lot of that is because people didn't listen to us in pain. And so we feel like, that, our pain, is not worth being listened to. So I would say that, as religious leaders, as whatever kind of leaders that we have in our access to humans, is that we have to be, we have to be comfortable with our own pain and not feel like there's a problem with that. And, help however we can educate or empower people to have a better understanding of themselves, their bodies. And so there's a lot of stuff that goes into that, much of that stuff they can be responsible for. And I hate to put it on them as responsibilities, but learn to live, have a life that's more, life-giving and not problem saturated, right? So I think, having a better understanding of what we do as therapists, but also, ways in which people bring the stories that they do, and can they re-author those stories in ways that are more life-giving? So I'm not saying therapists aren't valuable. I just know what I do is a lot of what I see, ministries can do as well, right? I just have a willingness to listen, right, and to have the education to interpret what I'm seeing in ways that maybe ministers can't. But there are always opportunities to do that. So. Yeah, that's right. That's right, Erica. And they don't, again, they get reduced as medical problems, right? Go fix this. And they don't know that, they listen to the doctors. Doctors have power the same way the religious leaders do have power, right? And not know that they can change their diets, but what's around them that is encouraging them to do that. There's a lot of education about, to give some of our social systems, public health systems. I get stuff about diabetes, heart disease all the time, right? But what is it on the inside of me that doesn't take that information and do anything with it? Like, who are the people in our lives that are supporting our health journeys, right? Because if we reduce ourselves to this narrow and not see ourselves in the context of our lives, right? We go home, you might be trying to lose some weight and everybody trying to, ask you out to eat, or, there's people who have been, satisfied with their own lives. And my daughter sees this. She works with Davita. She's a social worker. And so she sees people who are on dialysis who, at this stage of their life have a lot of regrets because they didn't know. They just accepted bad health is what it was. And, that's unfortunate. It's sad to hear that. Right. Just the ways that systems kind of set that up. So it goes back to the oppression of it, right? This is just how it is. This is my lot in life, and know that there's more. Right? At what point in their lives have they experienced the possibility of more, right? In their context, a lot of people have these narrow contexts that they're living their lives in, right? They same neighborhood or they same families, and they don't get an expansive view of what this life could be about, right? So they are going to just accept life as it is, which is important. So how we give people to a sense of knowing that a lot of people, young people, hadn't even been out their neighborhood, so they don't know about museums and all of that other kind of stuff, or just the access and the resources that they have in their own communities. So this sort of expansive way of seeing life as more than just this thing that I'm experiencing. Yeah, advocates too. I did that a lot when I was working in community, because a lot of mothers just didn't believe that they could ask questions. There's a lot of white people in those organizations, and they come with a sense of authority, very dismissive. So a lot of the work I did was empower, right? Like you did, empower folks to be advocate for themselves, right? I do a lot of psychoeducation. I don't assume folks don't have the knowledge. I ask, and then I do a lot of that in my practice, just helping people to understand themselves a little bit better. But advocacy is so it's not just going on the front lines marching. It is this way of helping people to understand themselves and that they have power in that. Sometimes the words used push people. Yeah. Well, I think guilt and shaming, right? So I came into church with a whole history of trauma and felt like I had no place for that. It was told that I wouldn't, the reason why you ain't close to God, or the reason why you're not doing this or experiencing this in your life because you're not close to God. So some of those things can be very shaming, and made you feel like it's your fault, right? And so I can show a lot of different scriptures about that, or even this sense of obedience, right? So not, I think, like you said, just kind of pushing people away, not recognizing that they're coming in with a whole bunch of history, right? That really doesn't have anything to do with their relationship with God, right? So yeah. Anyway, all right, you all about to get started.
Dr. Armstrong, so that we can stay on schedule.
I'm done.
Dr. Grier is in the house. And so we turn it over to Dr. Kauser so that she may introduce him.
Good to see you, Dr. Armstrong, with us. Absolutely.
Good to see you, Dr. Grier. I'm on the sidelines.
Good morning again, friends. Pleasure and delight to introduce a former student and now a professor, resume, and is delivering our fourth plenary session today. Dr. Nicholas Grier's counseling, writing, speaking, and community leadership privileges the experiences of the most vulnerable and marginalized people in society. He joined Bishop Wellness Center in November 2020 and currently serves as Associate Professor of Practical Theology, Spiritual Care and Counseling at Claremont School of Theology, and has a concurrent appointment as Adjunct Professor of Law at the Willamette University College of Law. Privileging the experiences of people on the margins of society, Dr. Grier enjoys nurturing cultures of self-awareness, resistance, healing, and liberation to make possible flourishing for everyone in the human village. He believes that everyone deserves fair opportunities to flourish. In his words, quote, "The journey to flourishing takes intentionality. On the journey to flourishing, one must be equipped with resources to survive, heal, and become liberated from past traumas and other life-limiting circumstances," unquote. He believes that it is important to equip clients with the resources to live self-aware and resilient lives in the context of life-giving communities. Dr. Grier practices therapy from an eclectic approach that takes seriously the process of cultivating liberation and healing from oppressive ideologies, cultures, institutions, relationships, and other life-limiting circumstances. He believes that it is important to draw from the strengths of clients. So in this sense, he practices therapy from a strengths-based approach. Ultimately, by focusing on individual and communal well-being, Dr. Grier believes that clients can be equipped with resources to survive and flourish. Dr. Grier is the author of the book, Care for the Mental and Spiritual Health of Black Men, Hope to Keep Going, and founder and chief executive officer of Coloring Mental Health Collective, LLC. In his downtime, he enjoys sports, listening to jazz and neo-soul music, playing the piano, dancing, spending time in nature, and connecting with friends and family. Nicholas Grier earned a Bachelor of Music degree from the Schwab School of Music at Columbus State University, the Master of Divinity and Doctor of Philosophy degrees from Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary on the campus of Northwestern University, and a certificate in psychotherapy from the Center for Religion and Psychotherapy. Dr. Grier, again, welcome to Black Church Studies at Louisville Theological Seminary. The floor, sir, is yours.
Thank you so much. A pleasure. Just to make sure, Dr. Kauser, can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear my audio okay? Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
I believe in the power of drawing from the genius of our African and African-American heritage. One of the resources I've been reflecting on, it's an article that talks about the power of music for African and African-American people, and the fact that this is it's necessarily a force of life. And one of the effects of colonization and ripping Africans, from their culture is minimizing this particular force of life. So I want to spend today's session drawing from one of our original tools and pieces of genius from our African and African-American tradition. I'll start off by sharing with you a song a simple song that I wrote just for our time together. Now, I'm more of an instrumentalist. I play piano, but I'll pad it with a little bit of vocals to share my appreciation and time for, and thanks for our time together this morning. I give thanks for the time we have together. I give thanks for the time we have today. I give thanks for the time we share together, for it is sacred time today. I give thanks for the time we have together. I give thanks for the time we have today. I give thanks for the time we have together, for it is sacred time today. I give thanks for the time we have together. I give thanks for the time we have today. I give thanks for the time we share together, for it is sacred time today. Yes, I give thanks for the time we have together. I give thanks for the time we share today. I give thanks for the time we have to spend with one another, for we are sacred, yes, we are. I give thanks for the time we have together. I give thanks for the time we share today. I give thanks for the time we share together, for it is sacred, for it is sacred, for it. Sacred time today. Well, good to spend this sacred time together with you. One of the things I believe is that it's important for us to honor our time together as sacred. And in fact, this is critical to our own well-being. If we can honor the ways in which each of our lives is sacred. If our lives are sacred and have sacred worth, then we treat one another as if our lives are sacred. One of the things I find to be very powerful is to connect deeply with all that helps us transcend the oppressive limitations of this world. And so one of the things that I really appreciate about the power of our spiritual traditions is that many of them have this dimension of gratitude, of giving thanks. And in fact, that's one of the pieces I name in some of my writing, that in order for us to be well, we've got to have a dimension in which we give thanks for the blessings in our lives. This is not a type of giving thanks where we minimize the necessary fight for justice and doing so unapologetically. But it is to say that a necessary part of our well-being is having thanks and giving thanks for the time we have together and for the blessings in our lives. I can think of one of the songs when I was still serving at a church in Chicago. We would have a Thanksgiving service, and oftentimes one of the old hymns will be, count your blessings, name them one by one, see what God has done. It's critical for us to name one by one the many blessings that we have together, and I find that to be a critical part of our well-being. One of the thinkers I appreciate is Anthony Penn, and one of the things that Anthony Penn says is that art is powerful for Black people, in part because one, in art, Black folks can paint a picture of the world as it is. So in the midst of us experiencing all that we experience, and people perhaps not acknowledging our realities, art, visual art, music, dance, it gives us a way to give full expression of the ways that we've experienced our lives. And then Anthony Penn says a second thing. He says that art also gives Black folks a way to paint a picture of the world as it ought to be. Right. So is this two dimensional piece of art that Anthony Penn finds to be very helpful for Black folks. One, it helps us to give full expression of the world as it is on our own terms. And then two, it helps us to paint a picture of the world as we see it to be. Obviously, this has incredible ties to community organizing. What does it mean for us to come together, to organize together, giving full expression to our own feelings and desires? And then what does it mean for us to come together to paint a picture of the world as we intend it to be on our own terms? And so throughout our time together today, I want to infuse it with the genius of music. And so I'll play a few tunes and then share with you some insights that I think are very helpful for helping us to sustain ourselves and to survive as Black folks. Now, you'll notice in my work, as I pointed to at the end of yesterday's session, that for me, it's not enough just to survive, right? It's not enough to just say, hey, we only want to be sustained, right? That's critically important. I mean, that's a first step, right? Every human being ought to be able to survive, right? I mean, this is what's so unjust to me about the systems, the oppressive systems in which many of ourselves find ourselves dancing in and out of, is that many white folks don't have this conversation about what does it mean to survive, right? That's not oftentimes a significant part of the conversation. And I see this a lot in my clinical practice in terms of a difference, generally speaking, in the ways in which people of color, especially Black folks, experience life compared to a lot of white folks. And so as I think about what it means for us to take seriously this rich tradition of music, I'll start off with Footprints. So this is a song by Wayne Shorter. One of the things that I believe strongly in is that we need to honor and to acknowledge the contributions of Black folks. And this is one way to cultivate our well-being, right? And that is to not ignore, not to erase the experiences and the contributions of Black folks. So this is the song Footprints by Wayne Shorter. Here it is. In fact, I'll change the microphone so you can hear the piano a little bit better. So that's the song Footprints. There are two things I want to take from this song. One is thinking about the legacy that we leave behind. If you think about footprints, one of the things I appreciate about music is the ways in which you can paint a picture of things and ideas through art, right? So as you think about footprints, you might imagine this motif I'm about to play now as the footprints. As we think about our lives, what footprints do we want to leave behind? I think this is a critical part of sustaining ourselves in various experiences of life. And that is to realize that, hey, we're living certainly in the present moment, but we're also living like many of our ancestors lived. We're living for subsequent generations. So when we stay connected to the lineage of our ancestors, ourselves, and then also realizing that, hey, we're also living in such a way to leave behind footprints for subsequent generations, that can guide the ways in which we live our lives today. A second piece I want to bring up, and this actually came to me as I was giving a talk with another group, and a person who was in the audience raised that it was fascinating that I would play various things, but then I would always come back to like a home base, right? So the home base of so no matter what else was happening, so even if I was playing a lot of things in the upper register, and so for instance, right, so no matter what the chaos, right? So if you imagine everything I was playing up here as the chaos, no matter what the chaos, I still had a home base to which to return. I find that to be critically important for Black folks living in a genocidal culture, is that no matter what else is happening in our lives, or no matter what else is happening around us, we have to have a home base to which we can return, a home base of love, support, and genuine care. This is one of the reasons why I put so much of an emphasis yesterday on community care, community well-being, that it's not just up to one individual to take care of themselves, but there ought to also be a community to which can be the home base, if you will, for us to return, no matter what else we experience in our lives. A second piece I want to play with you, to play for you, is this song by Thelonious Monk called Around Midnight. One of the reasons why I'm bringing this up is because this piece helps us to understand the power of dissonance for Black people, right? So in other words, dissonance is, at least in the Western music, is this clashing of notes. There was a time in the early church, the days of Gregorian chant, where if a musician played a particular dissonant interval, they would actually get kicked out of the church. So in other words, the church couldn't hold this type of interval that produced so much tension. And in fact, it was named as the devil's interval, right? And so this was that interval. This is how it sounds. Or if you take it down, whenever a musician would play that dissonant interval, in the church in the days of the early church of Gregorian chant, musicians will get kicked out for playing this interval. Let me play other dissonant intervals for you. So again, these dissonant intervals are intervals that appear to be this clashing of notes together that for some folks is not a welcome sight, right? They would prefer just to hear harmony. I think about it as like a kumbaya moment. They don't want to hear the dissonance, but here are a few other dissonant intervals. So this is how a dissonance sounds. There was a musician, a Thelonious Monk, who essentially made his money, if you will, off of playing dissonant intervals throughout his career as a pianist. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to play this tune around midnight, and you're going to hear dissonant intervals. But part of the point that I'm making here is that when you have dissonance in the context of other notes and other pieces of music, dissonance actually sounds very beautiful. And so one of the things that I like to emphasize to people is that don't judge the dissonance unless you understand the context. This is a critical point in terms of the mental well-being of the Black folks, is that we must give full attention to the context in which we live. There are some theories of care and counseling, even spiritual care, that do not acknowledge the context in which we live. And so because they do not acknowledge the context, they are not as beneficial and helpful for cultivating the well-being of Black folks. So here is Round Midnight. I want you to listen to the dissonance that's in there, but how the dissonance actually works very well in the context of the song. Make sure we get the mic ready for you. I hope that makes clear how beautiful dissonance is and can be. Um, and in fact, one of the things I often share with folks is I find it critically important to name dissonance as a way of life. In other words, what does it mean for us to welcome dissonance as a way of life? For instance, and understandably so, there are some things that we might not talk about in the Black community. There are some things that we might keep secret. Now, I think it's very important for people to have their own agency. In other words, for people to have their own power to determine what they're going to talk about and what they're not going to talk about. But I think there's also, when people are grounded and ready and well to do so, I think there's a power, that there's a beauty in being able to integrate dissonance as a way of life. So I could have played that piece without dissonance. It might have sounded somewhat okay, but it would not have been as soul stirring. It would not have touched deeply with the soul if I would not have engaged the dissonance within this song. So I hope that as we think about moving forward in our own lives and the work that we do, that we very intentionally welcome dissonance as a way of life, realizing the beauty and the deep connection with the soul that can come from welcoming this dissonance. Now, I also want to share with you a song that was actually brought up yesterday when I was inviting you all to share in the chat. A number of you all listed, things that were, important to you in terms of how you were doing yesterday. And one of you put in the chat the song, "It Is Well." And so I want to share with you all the ways in which we can connect with this song, "It Is Well." So I'm going to play the song, "It Is Well," and then I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think are some implications for this song, the power of it, as well as things that we might reflect on from this song. So here's the song, "It Is Well." So now I want to give you all an opportunity to share how did that song affect you? You can simply write it in the chat. What feelings do you have after hearing that song? See, calming, peace, calmness. Okay, a few of you all said peace. Calm, absolutely. Assurance, that's right, that's right. Oh yeah, keep sharing. I'm gonna step away from the mic to get something real quick, but keep sharing. Reassured, balance. Wow, oppression, no, that's real. Ease. Being in a neutral place. One of your favorite songs. Thinking about personal tragedy. Since regardless what happens, you will survive and thrive. Absolutely. As a Black man immigrant who left who left his country, you felt hope. Oh, that's good. That's good stuff. So feel free to keep sharing. See, Dr. Adams says that the Black church is not a balanced and holistic institution. So one of the things I want to share, two things with you about this song. One, I think it's critical to think about the power of resources that are aspirational. And in fact, I was teaching a course here at the Willamette Law School, and we were talking about different dimensions of the law and whether or not they actually represented our best ideals, and whether or not they actually, for instance, the justice, whether or not that's a real thing. And it was interesting. There's a Black man in the class, and he responded that he felt that the notion of justice in the law is more of an aspirational thing in many regards, but it's important to have aspirations. I bring this up because I think it's important for us to have resources in our canon, so to speak, that are aspirational. Even, in other words, even if we might not feel well, it's important for us to have a tune that reminds us that, oh, you know, it can be, and in fact, it should be well in my soul. So even though I'm going through things that might not make me feel well, I'm going to choose to push forward and to have myself to experience a type of being in which I am well. So I think that aspirational piece is very critical when we think about what it means for us to be well and to sustain ourselves and survive in the midst of the journey. The second thing I want to point out is I actually want to use the title of that song and ask the question, is it well? Right? I remember, you know, that's one of the things I began to question sometimes when I would think about the tremendous pain and hurt that I would often see in Black communities, and then, you know, in certain churches you would hear this song, "It Is Well," and, you know, people being touched by it. Again, I think it's a powerful song. Many of you shared in the chat the ways in which it's had a powerful effect on you even today. I think that also speaks to just the natural power of music. I think it's also important for us to reflect on what does it look like for us to be honest about our situations, to be honest about our emotional reality. I saw, I believe Dr. Kauser, you put in the chat, pain, you know, when you were reflecting on that, on the song. I think it's important for us, you know, even as we reflect on, for instance, a song like "It Is Well," for us to be able to acknowledge that, yeah, like we have had some suffering. We have had some pain. But being aware of that, we can then determine how we can pave a path forward for ourselves, having acknowledged the truth. I think part of what hurts us is when we don't acknowledge the truth, and then we try to proceed while yet covering those things up and not ever working through those realities. I think that's one of the great sins of this country is what would it look like for the United States of America to actually acknowledge fully the tragedy, the genocide of Black people in this country, but yet it just continues to proceed. And in fact, I remember I was preaching at a church in Los Angeles, and Reverend James Lawson was there, and I was just shocked that he was in the audience, but it made sense because he was pastor emeritus of that church. But then we began to talk afterwards, and James Lawson was still very passionate in saying that I'm afraid that if the United States continues in the form of progress, with its sense of progress, without acknowledging the ways that it continues to oppress Black people, the nation will never meet its highest ideals. And so I found it to be very critical for us to face the truth of our reality, for the context in which we're in, to acknowledge fully the ways in which Black people have been treated across generations, so that we can indeed reach both our highest ideals as a people, Black people, as well as this country. The last thing I want to share with you is what does it mean to take seriously the power of music to create the world as we want it to be. This, again, is one of the things that Anthony Penn named in some of his work, was that it's critically important to see that in art, not only can Black people give full expression of themselves, of their lives on their own terms, but they can also paint a picture of the world as they wish it to be. And so I'm going to play something that I'm actually just making up in the moment, imagining the world as I wish it to be. So I'm going to play this and then we can open it up for some dialogue. All right. Thank you so much for sharing this time together this morning.
All right.
I want to open it up now for some dialogue.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Grier.
Yes.
Questions have been in the chat ever since we got started.
Excellent.
So I'm going to go back to from the beginning. All right. Let's see, where do we begin? I had it and then some technical stuff. Let's see, what was the
Excellent.
first question back here?
I'm just gonna move my equipment around so I can see the chat
Okay,
with
you're
you. So I'm gonna sit down with you.
First question, how do you survive in uncertain times with shifting sands under your feet? That question is asked by Melvin.
Melvin, can you say more about what you mean? You can feel free to mute yourself.
That's webinar. He can't unmute. He'll have to put it in chat.
Oh, excellent.
Well, before that, he put painting a picture as it is. Painting a picture of it should be. Then ask, how do you survive in uncertain times with the shifting sands under your feet?
Interesting. So how do we exist in uncertain times with shifting sand? I think part of it is having a core to which to return. And it's part of what I was naming in one of the pieces that I shared with you, was that there has to be some type of foundation, some loving foundation to which we can return. So this looks like having communities that are loving and can be present with us, to journey with us. Again, one of the things I was emphasizing yesterday in the communal model of change that I was presenting, the Hope to Keep Going community model of change that I presented, I find it to be critically important for there to be communities that can always be intentionally reflecting on how can we help various people survive, how can we help them to heal, how can we help them to resist when they need to resist, how can we help them to be free, to be liberated. It was fascinating. I was meeting with a particular Black man in the counseling session yesterday, and it was just beautiful watching the ways in which he was free, right? In fact, because I had journeyed with them, right, for a couple of years, and so we were just sharing together, and I was like, man, you free, right? And just a big smile came over his face, right, because we were reflecting on the ways in which he had experienced various things that were changing continuously in his life. So there has to, I think there has to be multiple spaces where Black folks can return in the midst of uncertain times. So that includes whether it's a therapist, whether it's a spiritual caregiver, whether it's some type of guru, whether it's some type of mentor. Again, as I mentioned, it needs to be a community that's present with people. And so because the forces of oppression are so all-encompassing, we need a comprehensive approach. I mean, that's one of the things I've written about as well, is that we need a comprehensive approach of care and counseling, especially because of the realities in which we find ourselves in, including the shifting times that folks experience.
Okay. Melvin also asks, can dissonance resemble shadow work?
Can you say more in the chat, Melvin, about what you mean?
Okay, while he's doing that, I can go to another question. Is there a cross-cultural element with Monk's dissonance and the chromaticism of the 19th century Romantic style combining to form a unique blend?
Well, I wish that we had a microphone so we can hear people elaborate on these comments. It's a powerful connection. Well, first thing I think about is I think it speaks to what can be human, right? In terms of the shared the shared gift that music is to many of folks, to give full expression to the complexities of our experiences. So whether we're talking about the Romantic period, like I happen to love folks like Rachmaninoff, right? And the ways in which his music I think is so beautiful. And even thinking about the chromaticism within, for instance, like Chopin, and so when I think about the beauty of both the Romantic era of music, as well as various dimensions of chromaticism and the genius of somebody like a Thelonious Monk, and how he intentionally leans into the dissonance, I think it's clear evidence that there is a dimension of experience that gives full acknowledgement to dissonance in our lives. But the question is, will we choose to acknowledge fully dissonance?
Okay, he mentions further down, I guess in response to your asking him, music and the arts facilitates emotional intelligence, which brings the balance necessary to navigate the nightmare of this neoliberal age.
Yes, absolutely.
Like a home base to be refueled or renewed.
Yeah, that's huge. I totally agree. And when I think about the power of music, so it's fascinating. When I first started teaching here at the law school at Willamette University, I started to introduce students to doing opening centerings, right? So we've done this in many of our spaces, as theologians and seminaries, churches, various faith communities. But it was fascinating when I first invited them to start doing these opening centerings as a way to connect deeply with things which are beyond the cognitive, or perhaps even in addition to the cognitive. They're like, what? They couldn't really fully grasp what that meant. But what's powerful is, so I went to the American Association of Law Schools Conference in San Diego this past January. And so one of the things that I found very powerful was that, for instance, even within the community of law, like they are acknowledging the need to have these centering moments and to pay attention to emotional intelligence and emotional well-being. So in fact, that's one of the things I'm working with the law school here on in terms of programming and curriculum, because the American Bar Association now is naming within their revised American Bar Association Standard 303B and C that law schools now have to pay attention to the well-being of their law students, because they see the ways in which many folks who are practicing as lawyers and those who are law students have not been well mentally and emotionally. So when I was at this conference in San Diego, there were actually sessions at this law conference that were paying particular attention to centering. Right? I was like, oh wow, look at here now. The law profession is actually taken very seriously, right? Having centering moments, and they were naming the importance of having these centering moments in the beginning of classes and things of that sort. So I think you across disciplines, you were finding that people are recognizing that it's critically important to have a type of connection beyond just a type of cognitive and intellectual work, right? But it needs to also, part of the beauty of returning to, I think about the power of Sankofa, right? Going back to fetch it in order to pave a way forward that's built on the grounds of justice, healing, and liberation. Part of the beauty of that is acknowledging the genius of one of the geniuses of our heritage, right? As Black and African people, is to name that, hey, music is a force. I mean, that was one of the things that I was really struck by in some of my recent research on music as a tool for social transformation, is that these authors were naming that music, they were naming explicitly that the music is a force to help us to create the world as we want it to be, and that has always been a part of African culture. So absolutely, I totally see that there is a powerful way for music to be a type of renewing force for us, and a necessary force. I mean, you think about the ways in which music was present in the civil rights movement. So there's precedence, right? For the ways in which music is a powerful force to nurture forward movement. I think what we can do even more is to be very intentional from where we are in the present moment and in the future, to make music and the lessons of music as something that can be incredible resources for our organizing work around well-being and justice for Black people.
Okay, 2 questions related to wellness. Melvin asks, is wellness the absence of hurt and pain? And Kenya asks, can wellness be the dissonance of joy and pain?
Wow. So the first question was, can wellness be the absence of pain?
Wellness, the absence of hurt and pain. Yes.
Yeah.
Next one is the dissonance of joy and pain.
Right. So responding to the first one in terms of wellness being the absence of it. And I wrestle with this, right? In terms of when I think about the power of music, one of the reasons why I feel like some of the things that I play touch me so deeply, even when I play, as well as touch others, is because, and not just me as a musician, but other Black musicians, there's a sense in which it's so beautiful and so soul stirring because they connect deeply with the pain. I connect deeply with some of the pain that I've experienced throughout life and can make beautiful music from it. Now, one of the reasons why I wrestle with that is because I don't think that we ought to have an existence that's built off of pain. I think that's some of the work of Victor Anderson, right? Reflecting on, Black folks ought not to have an identity that's built solely on, pain and suffering and having to resist that pain and suffering. And so I think that's part of the conversation. But at the same time, none of us, depending on our cosmologies, right? In other words, some people, believe fully, and I think we should acknowledge that, that perhaps we were here in other lifetimes, so that perhaps we had an influence on the present moment, and there's something that we can learn from previous lifetimes, and taking seriously the present moment. In this sense, none of us chose, outside of the cosmology I just named, none of us chose to be in this circumstance in terms of, we didn't ask for the at least me, myself, and I in this lifetime, I did not ask for the mid-Atlantic slave trade to happen. I did not ask for lynching to happen. I did not ask to have moments where I've had the police call on me in multiple points in my lifetime. These are not things that I or others asked for, but it is the present moment. And so I think as a way to honor the present moment, we've got to be able to take whatever the present moment is and to live with a sense of integrity that paves a path forward, and a future that is that resonates deeply with the work of justice and healing and flourishing, right? So in that sense, I'm not God, right? In terms of naming why. From a process perspective, we might say, okay, maybe we're all in process and God is in process, so we help God change. So in that sense, I think there's a way in which we can name that, okay, this is the history that we've been given. This is our current reality of pain. So then our job is to, if we do take a process theological perspective seriously, okay, so our job then is to work with God to change the present and the future in such a way that it's not full of pain, and so that pain is not as present, if not present at all. So I do think, given our current circumstances, in other words, I and many of us could have been born and could have been one of the folks who were on one of the ships, right? One of the slave ships. And so in that sense, I think we have to then, and even now, we have to face the current reality and to consider how can we be well no matter what. And I think there is a way to be well even in the midst of dimensions of pain happening. There being dimensions of pain within us. But I think one of the things I tell folks is that I have a sense of ontological peace, which for me means that no matter what happens, there's going to be some struggle, but no matter what happens, I've got this sense of overall peace. Some folks talk about it, referencing the scripture, that there's this peace that surpasses all understanding. So for me, I believe there's a way to live life with this type of ontological peace, so that no matter what happens, we can still be well. So so from that perspective, I do think that given our current moment in time in history, that there will be moments of pain, and I think that's part of what constitutes African American care in this moment, is to say that, okay, given the forces of oppression and pain that we experience, we've got to be able to craft a way forward so that we can be well regardless. But I think part of that forward movement and that vision is to think about how can we imagine a world where pain does not exist, and where my music and other people's music can still be beautiful even without having to recall, even if it's unconsciously, pain in our lives.
Okay, I think Melvin has clarified. Jungian shadow work is the integration of light and dark. Is this similar to dissonance and music?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just be honest. So I know one of my mentors, Dr. Butler, spent some time studying Jungian work and included that in some of his earlier work. I myself am not really up on Jungian work. I just didn't research much of that. So yeah, but perhaps you have some insights on that I might not have.
Another question asks, in what ways does your ministry connect African immigrants and African American people?
Wow, I really wish we had a microphone to hear these excellent questions. Well, I'll say this. One of the things that, so I'll give two examples. One is, I think there has to be a practical dimension to our work. And so one of the practical things that I do now is to serve on the Oregon Department of Education's Black and African American Student Success Plan. And to me, that is sacred work, because essentially you have Black folks throughout the state who are working with school systems to ensure that that Black folks have Black students can have Black success and well-being. So included in that, are Black folks from various countries in Africa, who are now living here in Oregon. And so we have incredible statistics, right, in terms of the various, African countries that are represented within the state of Oregon. And so part of that work was put in place because you had a number of Black folks who within the state who said that, hey, we need to hold the state accountable because the state is failing our African, immigrant students, as well as our Black, students, African American students here, from the U.S. And so essentially from that, folks were able to organize so that it demanded the state to do something about the ways in which the state was failing our Black students. And so essentially, keep in mind, the education industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry. So even when I say this number, like it's still pennies compared to it. But so we were able to get $14 million from the state. It came under attack, in this recent gubernatorial election. But thankfully, the candidate that we were pushing won, and so the program continues. But yeah, so essentially, we were able to get, I should say, the folks who were a part of it before I became a part of the work, they were able to get $14 million, so that we then worked with various organizations throughout the state of Oregon, as well as working with the school systems to ensure that Black students have a chance at success. So it includes both academic success as well as one of the things I've been advocating very strongly with the committee is emotional well-being and mental health as well. So in that sense, we our commitment is in responsibilities are twofold. One is to find various organizations around the state to work with schools to support Black students, and then two, it is to develop a plan which we've been working on so that every school system within the state of Oregon can support our African immigrant students as well as our African American students from the United States. So that's one of the concrete ways that I find that my work is committed to it. The second thing I'm thinking through is this work that I'm doing we name ourselves the Above Ground Emancipation Movement. So this is a group that Dr. Carol Watkins Ali and I got together and pulled together a number of Black scholars and clinicians, including Doctors Marsha Foster Boyd, Manuel Arte, and several others. Cedric Johnson, Kenya Tuttle's a part of that as well, who presented for this workshop or for this consultation. So essentially within that group, we made a decision. We first started meeting in 2018, and we had to make a decision about how our work will proceed. One of the things we're working on now is an edited book volume that focuses on the resources for justice and healing from within African American communities. And so we had to make a decision about how do we proceed with that work. And so one of the things we thought through was, okay, even though we're talking about Black people in the United States, it needs to take very seriously Blackness from from an Africana perspective that takes seriously Blackness globally. Those are two ways that I find myself engaged in that work.
Great. I have a question. Does the elimination of music programs in our school systems, how does that impact our children and their mental health?
Yeah, I mean, one of my former professors used to say that some folks need to have an epistemological rupture. In other words, what's meant by that is folks' foundation of what's important and folks' foundation of knowing needs to change. Because in other words, I just demonstrated, music has been a central part of African heritage and culture, and a central part of knowing. So I think that's another element of colonization that folks might not make that explicit connection, but absolutely it's detrimental. I mean, I was, fortunate enough to grow up in a family where my grandmother, she sang, she played piano, she made all of her children learn how to either sing or play something, that they had to do something, right? Grandma Sylvia didn't play she might have been small in stature, but she would jack you up, if she felt like you were out of line and not doing things well. But she cared very deeply for her family, and wanted to make sure that we had opportunities to succeed and to be well. So yeah, I was fortunate to have a family where music was like a natural language. Fortunate to have in elementary, middle, and high school in Atlanta. I had music programs. So that by the time I studied music in undergrad, I still felt like there were some white folks who might have had additional resources that I didn't have. But I definitely had a lot of resources, from those music programs. Even in high school, it was a predominantly Black high school in Atlanta, North Atlanta High School, School of the Performing Arts. I don't think they still have the magnet program now, but it used to be a program where many of us Blacks in Atlanta, we could go to North Atlanta High School. Even though it wasn't in my zone, I was able to, because of my musical talents, I was able to audition and to experience that. So at the high school, I was able to be a part of, marching band. If any of you all know about the marching bands in the Dirty South, right? That's the thing, right? It's a big culture. I feel like that was a big part of my formational experience. So being part of the marching band, I played saxophone there, as well as, we had a piano program at the high school. Again, we had a Black teacher. We had a Black piano teacher who was actually the organist at Ebenezer Baptist Church, where Dr. King was, one of the ministers, and where, Senator Warnock is currently pastoring. So we had a teacher from there who was our piano teacher. We had a Black choral director. We had a person to teach music theory. We had a person where I was going to be a part of the jazz band. So all of it is to say, I do think it's a tragedy that many of our schools have, in addition to trying to ban critical race theory and African studies, Black studies, banning music. I mean, that's detrimental. And in fact, I just got a report. This is the last thing I'll share. I just got a report yesterday. I think it was produced by the CDC. But it was a pretty comprehensive report on the mental well-being. It was a 10-year study tracking the mental well-being of our children and teens, and it was just the data is just significant in terms of the ways in which we could have a whole session on this, but essentially the Black folks we're underreported, and Black teens in terms of when they ask the question about mental distress, so Blacks, did not scale as high on that compared to other groups. But when you look at suicidal ideation and suicide, Blacks scaled higher. Right. So one can interpret that data. One of the things I'm thinking through is I wonder if part of it is perhaps Black folks maybe holding some of the pain, and maybe don't have as many resources as perhaps some, white teens and others. Like when I deal with, especially college students, like white college students, oftentimes they'll come to me having had years of therapy and counseling, so they know how to work that system. But many of our Black folks don't come in that same way. So in that sense, I think that one interpretation of the data could be that perhaps Black teens are experiencing some pain and maybe holding it in, so that by the time it comes to the point where they're the tipping point and they then engage in suicidal ideation or commit suicide or attempt suicide, that perhaps it's because they had not had the resources of support that some of the others had. I can think of people concretely in terms of one Black family where there's their son's transition date is this month, right? And it continues to affect them. So I've said a lot, but I think it speaks to the urgency of this work and the urgency for us to organize for the mental, emotional, and psychological well-being of Black folks.
All righty. Thank you so much, Dr. Grier, for sharing with us these last 2 days. We especially appreciate that since you're out on the West Coast, that you're 3 hours ahead of us. So this was really early morning for you.
Yes, it was.
You and your students who shared in
Absolutely.
the breakout sessions for your sacrifice of time and sharing your gifts and talents with us for this Black Church Studies consultation. I am now about to decrease and turn it over to Dr. Gerald Taylor, who serves as the project consultant for the Nehemiah project. He will take us through the architectural vision for Nehemiah churches in the 21st century. And following that, he will do our closing remarks and end our session. Dr. Taylor.
Good morning, everyone. Hope you all are doing well. Brother Grier, you tickle some ivory there, brother. Appreciate it. Appreciate it. What I'm going to go through now is a development in the Nehemiah project, which has been an effort to work with rethinking, particularly the rural Black church and the Black inner city church going into the 21st century, coming out of COVID. And I want to set this up by referencing something that a lot of our folk know very little history about, which is the Rosenwald project from 1912 to 1932, that where Black folks built 5,000 schools in the South, raised over $4.7 million to do that, built 5,388 schools, 217 teachers' homes, 163 shop buildings for shops, 883 counties in the United States where this was done. Use architectural plans, state-of-the-art architectural plans for these schools drawn up by professors at Tuskegee Institute. This is a history which very few of us know well, but it formed the basis of the education of a generation of African Americans that led the struggle for the freedom movement moving forward from that period on. It's in that light that the idea that the Nehemiah project has been exploring is a similar architectural vision as part of a strategy to rethink the rural Black church and the inner city Black church in this moment in time, using our resources, our assets in a different way and reimagining them in a different way to facilitate the kind of ministry strategies and work we would have to do and connections we would have to do to our people in this time. This was done in conjunction with the University of Kentucky School of Architecture. Dr. Roscoe Linton and I reached out to engage this process. The School of Architecture was excited about the relationship to do this. And so what you're going to see is a process that 2 students from the School of Architecture met with pastors and lay people at one of our 7 churches, so 14 students visiting the 7 churches, meeting with the pastor and lay people, discussing ministry hopes and vision and possibilities and what they'd like to see done with their facility or the land that the church may have owned in a different way. And those students then went back and put together what you're about to see as a possibility going forward for these 7 churches that we're going to go through. This is the beginning of a process where all 14 churches will be done. This is Johnson Chapel, and you're seeing some of the ideas and the renderings and the drawings for this, the use of the space. There are 3 phases for each church. Phase 1, which is the transformation of the current facility. Phase 2 is an expansion of that facility or looking at a new space. And then phase 3 is the full reimagining of the space land that's owned by the church. So you're seeing right now, we're still in Johnson Chapel. All right. So now you're hearing some of the sectional readings. You'll see phase 1, phase 2. And these are done by, this work, the examples of what the students went to look at. 4 of the 14 students, if my memory serves me right, were African-American students at the School of Architecture, which was nice to see, participating in this project. Again, you're seeing the design work of the students. Okay. Keep advancing. This is phase 3, which would include all the expansion to include the activity spaces. Now you're seeing some renderings of what those spaces could look like. Now we're moving on to Taylortown AME Zion Church's work done by the 2 students from the School of Architecture. This is phase 1, the existing building. Each project had history attached to it. Now you're seeing phase 2, the Family Life Center envisioning done by these 2 students. It has 3 phases to it. Transforming the church facility. This was done by 2 African-American female students at the School of Architecture who were assigned to Taylortown. All of this work is dramatic and impressive on the part of these students at the School of Architecture. Now we move to St. John's Chapel. Again, different churches with different physical characteristics. There's the team, what they were asked to consider. And here again, you'll begin to see the very reimagining of the space for the church. Phase 1, again, the existing facility, what they saw doing with that. Phase 2, expansion. And then phase 3, the additional rebuilding of that. And now it's the daycare center, phase 1, 2, and phase 3. Now we move on to Campbell Chapel in Bloomfield, Kentucky. Again, there are 3 phases: renovating the existing addition and moving through that. And so the premise of this strategy is that we have literally thousands of Black rural churches with small facilities in the current reality, and that the idea of a scaled strategy to think like the Roswell Project thought about schools for Black children during that period when they were not able to get to schools that whites would not allow. The idea of using our facilities, using our existing spaces to transform them into centers of agitation and hope and opportunity in every rural community where the church, Black church is, and giving young people and adults an opportunity to help reimagine these places together and to rethink their connection to church through this process. So now, again, you're seeing some of the design proposals for, again, the existing phase one is about the existing spaces. Phase two, addition of a courtyard. And this is now, we've now moved on to Wesley Chapel, Wesley United Methodist Church. So you're seeing, again, the proposals for their church. As I said, a phase one and a phase two and a phase three. So again, moving through it, and hopefully you'll have some chance to ask some questions at the end of this before we wrap up. Now we move on to Lampkins Chapels, CME Church in Louisville. These are some of the needs that the members of the church expressed. And then what you're going to see is a design framework for the facility. So you see phase one is the existing building and what to do with that. Phase two, expansive connecting of the church to the hopeful phase three, which is a family life center. And again, these were worked by students at the School of Architecture. They are not official architectural drawings because they're not licensed, but they form the basis of what could be taken to a licensed architect or to a project planner to price out the project and what it would cost in each of the phases. Sherman Chapel. Again, each church has a different footprint, and the students were charged with coming up with a creative design based on that footprint and what the church's land availability to use was and could be. A very unique idea for this church that the students came up with. Again, you see phase one, phase two, and phase three. And again, a rendering of what that could look like. It is our expectation that we will begin, hopefully, during a similar process for our churches in the Nehemiah Project in the western part of Kentucky and in Ohio over the course of this year. So let me lead over any questions anybody has about what we're doing in the Nehemiah effort with this process and where we're intending to take it.
Professor Taylor, this is Angela. Can you hear me?
Yes.
What are the next steps from those renderings?
The next steps will be that each church has had a building inspection to kind of determine the current status of their physical facilities, to determine what the current building conditions ought to have to be addressed. Second step will be an appraisal to be done on the properties that each church has. So we determine what is the asset base for each church. And then we would bring in project estimators who will come in and give us an estimation on what it would cost to do phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 for each church. And then to create a vehicle to raise the resources to be able to carry out those phases beginning in 2024. Any other questions or comments regarding what we're doing with this aspect of the project?
Dr. Couser asked, would resources come from the USDA?
It would be one of many sources that we would be able to look at tapping once we had a vehicle like a community development corporation that we're potentially discussing with denominational leaders to set up. Then we would have a way to capture large amounts of resources. The other part that's really critically important is that each church has assets, and that we're going to need those assets to be leveraged as kind of a down payment on the projects that each church does. I mean, it's hard for people to believe that the Rosenwald project was built that many church schools and homes and whatnot. Black folks in those rural communities raised $4.7 million at that amount in that time. That is not what that would be worth today. It would be worth many, many multiples of that today. Was raised by poor rural people, raised that money to build these schools in rural communities. That's the same vision, the same commitment that we're trying to develop in Nehemiah with this concept of re-envisioning the local church as a different kind of place and space needed for our people in the communities today in the 21st century.
Reverend Combs says, awesome job in your imaging. Does your teams consider parking and code associated with expansion?
Yes, yeah, they do. So in each of the ones that we've done so far, they've taken into account parking and those issues that were identified. Now, again, these are students, so they're not licensed architects yet. But this quality of work sets a very good bar to take to a professional architect or project estimator to start thinking about what the work would actually cost to get done. And of course, there can be modifications made based on going forward. But the idea again is to say that we have literally thousands of historic Black churches in rural areas of our country, particularly in the South and the Midwest and others, that were built for a certain time, and to accompany an understanding of church and theology at that moment. The world has changed. COVID has changed everything for good. And so the idea is to reimagine these spaces, because nobody else will do that for us other than ourselves, to think about how to reimagine these churches going forward, and then creatively thinking about how to do that.
Dr. Taylor, may I make a comment from
Sure,
Wesley
please.
United Methodist Church? You and I have talked many times about funding for this project. And over the Christmas and New Year's timeframe, our church was flooded. It just so happened, and you've been there, it flooded in the exact areas that they were recommending to renovate. And based on that, of course, our insurance company is going to take care of all of the expense. I didn't know how it was going to happen, but God did it. And our church is 45 years old. We are not together with the parking lot. I agree with that. Nor are we together with the ADA restrictions for bathrooms, for wheelchairs and those things to enter and exit. So had it not been for the Nehemiah project, we would be lost as to where we needed to go to renovate our facility. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Moore.
All righty. Mary Lane Wright asked, what about elevators and ADA equipment?
That was taken into account in each project's description based upon what the local folks suggested be done. Now, in some of the spots, some of the locations, the putting in of elevators, I'm not sure about that. So each church was different. You'd have to ask each team that they take into account fully ADA requirements or the need for elevators. I know that in the churches that we're going to be doing in the western part of Kentucky, that'll be a major architectural challenge, is how to address steps and stairs and small rooms. And a lot of the churches have those small spaces where you cannot get wheelchairs in and around in the old configurations. So yes, that was part of what was the test for the students, was to come up with ways to address some of those questions.
Okay, Dr. Adams asked, based on the reimagining work that has already been done within the Nehemiah project, would you recommend or suggest that the churches make the architectural improvement of their physical buildings their top priority for 2023-24?
I don't think it's an either or question. I think that the existing membership of churches need to rethink, what they can do by way of ministry and the given realities of the communities we sit in today. A lot of what we discussed over the last 2 days has profound impact on that and how we think about it. But I do know that if we do not reimagine these spaces, because in many of these communities, people are leaving these communities, young people are not connecting to these churches. One, because they come to them and they don't see anything that looks like anything that they would want to be connected to. And what is the program there that they can see? And in many of our communities, we need a beacon, a sign of hope. If you look at these visualizations of what these places could look like, they are going to be the most impressive architectural buildings in those communities. They become a beacon, a possibility. And so I do think that this is a priority. I do think that in rural and inner city areas that this becomes and should be a priority for our denominations to focus on, because that is where we have a chance to rethink, reimagine, rethink about planting church as opposed to simply trying to sustain. I've asked everybody, what is the legacy going to be of these places for the next generation, or will there be a legacy? And this great historic church and our traditions to be continued in a way has to be owned by the next generation if it is to proceed. And that is why this idea, we've kind of come to this idea of integrating. This, the beauty of the music discussion today, we'll come back to, is a different way of integrating theology and possibility. The architectural visioning is another way of integrating theology and ministry in a new way. And I do believe that all of our churches have some capacity. It's the widow's mite story, but we have it, and we need to invest, as our foreparents did, to build those schools in the historically Black communities when nobody else would put our kids in any schools during that period. So yes, I'm a strong believer this should be a co-priority with thinking about how we rethink ministry.
Okay, another question. What is your hope going forward with this particular project? And as many churches are declining in this country, what is your hope about Black churches?
I think we have to allow this next generation to remake the world again. And that means remake the church again. That means to be able to ask the questions about what does it mean to be people of faith? Who is God? And what does it mean? Some of the questions that were raised over these 2 days about suffering and where people are. We need to allow the next generation to engage that and to overcome their deep skepticism and cynicism about the church. And I think the way we try to do that is by encouraging them to participate in the reimagination and the recreation of the Black church going forward. And we have to be open to that and create these spaces for that. And we will not succeed everywhere. We're going to make mistakes on how we try to do that, but we have to at least engage that. In some cases, in the case in Charlotte where I'm working, we're asking Black churches to consider providing their land for leasing to build affordable housing in the city where our people can't afford to live. But our churches own land, and they have the capability of being able to use that land to advance the sustainability of Black life in these cities where it's being driven out, if we choose to do so. And that's the challenge. Are we willing to revisit who we are in light of the current reality?
All righty. I think that's it for the questions. So we're kind of 6 minutes ahead. So if you want to go on into your closing, we'll let you do that.
All right. Well, I think that we've had today two of the most interesting and engaging sessions, I think, on mental health that I've ever sat in on. And I hope you all feel the same way. I think that we have had a framing of this question in a way that has been helpful and thoughtful and gives us moments for pause. As I said, I think Brother Grier really tickled those ivories for us this morning and gave us another whole look at music in light of mental health. So I do think that we have a real challenge as a community going forward from this consultation. Our people are in crisis in many places, exacerbated by the pandemic. We do not have the resources in rural areas, for example, to help our people be able to address some of this. And so a question becomes, how do we get resources to our people in rural areas and inner city areas where these resources don't exist presently? We have young people in a state of crisis trying to figure out who they are and what their future is going to look like, and they're being pulled and by social media. I hope that in our discussions about mental health, that one thing I would hope that maybe we can build on is social media and its impact on mental health in a serious way, trying to understand that, because that's where a lot of our people are sitting. But I thought it was very challenging, very engaging, and offered us a network of people who we can go to help us think this through more intentionally in many of our places. So I think that has been a signature part of what we had. I hope that the architectural piece was helpful to people, gave people a sense of a possibility of another element of our thinking through the Black church going forward and what the future of the church may or can or hopefully could be. So those two things that we did today, I hope have been helpful to everyone. And thank you for being in attendance for the course of these 2 days and through the worship service on Wednesday night. So I'll leave it at that. And if everybody is agreeable, I'll close this out with prayer and we'll wrap this up. Let me take a moment and pause. In the midst of the darkness, in the midst of the difficult times, We have been given a vision of what can be possible by coming together as a people in your name. We ask for strength. We ask for wisdom in this moment, in these difficult moments that our people are currently facing in this country and everywhere in the world. We ask for your strength. We ask for your guidance. We ask for your willingness to let us muddle through this as best we can to do your word. Bless those who have attended this session. Bless the presenters. Bless those who gave us worship and food for sustenance over the course of these 2 days. Bless the team that put this together and the institution which has been willing to host it. And all these things we ask in your most precious and magnanimous name. Amen.